Hey family, welcome back to my video. Today we will see, what if Harry Potter was the Prince of the Darkness? It's the last episode of our Darkness series. Before we start, I would like to extend my sincere thanks to the original author of this story for granting us permission to use it in our YouTube video. Your generosity is greatly appreciated. The author's creation and the original story's link in the descriptions. Please do check that first. Now enjoy the video. The summer of 1993 had been a long and torrid one, drawn-out days with a blistering sun. Harry, Hermione and their friends had spent most of the summer in the sizable lake in the forest on the Riddle Manor grounds. Although meager compared to Hogwarts' Black Lake, it was big for a private property lake. Situated in a large clearing inside the woods with a two-level waterfall. Large smooth rocks and moss covered the magic-made walls of the waterfall, with places to jump off at halfway in the top. Tom had cast many charms on the surrounding trees to prevent them from overgrowing and blocking the sun. The charms meant the water was warm but also helped the beautiful wildflowers to grow in the grass around the lake. Harry and Hermione loved to spend their summer days down there swimming if they weren't on holiday overseas with the family. Unfortunately, the summer was officially ending, and with the new year at Hogwarts approaching, it was time for the annual trip to Diagon Alley. Master Harry. A squeaky high voice pierced Harry's dreams, waking him with a jolt. The 13-year-old groaned at the bright sunlight coming through his now opened curtains. No, Harry whined, rolling over in his bed and pulling the blankets up over his head. It's the summer holidays. I is sorry, Master Harry, but Yow's father is being insistent. Pippin, Harry's nanny elf, squeaked. Yow's is going shopping today. Harry yelped as with a snap of his fingers, Pippin lifted his blanket off him and had it folded at the foot of the bed. I hate you, Harry growled, eyes shut tight. Yes, I know, Master Harry, Pippin smiled. Now up's Yow's get. Harry grumbled as he rolled and fell out of the bed. His head popped up with his brown curly hair a total mess, sticking out from his head everywhere like he had been electrocuted. His killing curse green eyes were hazy with sleep as he climbed to his feet, stretching out his arms with a deep yawn. Not bothering to change out of his silvery blue acromantula silk pajama set, the shorts and buttoned shirt were light, airy and comfortable. Closing his bedroom door, he headed to breakfast, hoping the kitchen elves had made pancakes this morning. Good morning, Hermione greeted him with her own yawn as she came out of her room just as Harry was passing her door. Her hair was just as bad as Harry's, but she had managed to wrestle it into an awful neon yellow scrunchie. Dressed in an identical pajama set to Harry's, she joined him walking down the hallway. What's so good about it? Harry complained as he rubbed his eyes. Being woken up at the crack of bloody dawn, he continued with a scowl. It's 8:30, Harry. Hermione rolled her sparkling green eyes as she scratched her head. We wake up earlier at Hogwarts. Yes, but that's school, Harry retorted as they entered the dining room where their parents were already at the table. Their dad reading the Daily Prophet with a strong coffee, their mum sipping her favorite breakfast tea. It is the holidays and I want to sleep in, he said with a sharp nod as he collapsed into a chair, Hermione sighing with a head shake as she took her seat. Good morning, my little snakes, Cassie cooed, standing up and leaning over to kiss their cheeks softly. Why are we up this early? Harry asked as blinked tiredly. We are going to Diagon Alley today, Tom replied as he flicked the page. Not much interesting to him in the news this week. Cassiopeia frowned when she saw Harry and Hermione yawn yet again. How much sleep did you two get? Cassie asked suspiciously, sharing a look with Tom when both children stayed quiet. Hermione, their mother persisted. I finished my book, she admitted questioningly. It was amazing and I just couldn't put it down, she defended herself. Harry? Tom asked, placing the paper down in his lap, dreading the answer when the boy winced. I was in the library with Hermione, listening to Australia versus New Zealand Quidditch match on the WWN. He finally admitted. The Wizarding Wireless Network could be tuned to many different programs. The most popular channels being The World of Quidditch, Witching Hour and Toots, Shoots, and Roots. What time did you two finally go to bed if you didn't stay in bed after we said good night and lights out at 9:30? Cassiopeia sighed. Harry hesitated, pursing his lips as if to keep his secrets in. Well, we swear we didn't realize how late it was. How late? Tom asked sternly. Maybe close to 1 o'clock in the morning, Hermione finally breathed out. Harry sank in his chair and Hermione bit her lip when their mother groaned and ran her hands over her face, their father just sitting there with a frown. Hermione, Harry, I know you love to read and Quidditch, and I will never take those away from either of you. But there are reasons we have curfews and times for hopping into bed and lights out. It's so you get a good night's sleep, waking up energized and well rested. It helps with keeping you healthy and happy as well. We already let you stay up later in the holidays to Hogwarts curfews for your age group. She sighed. How about this? Tom started. Lights out will be extended to 10 o'clock only on nights when you are close to finishing a book, or you think a match will end soon. If it isn't finished in that extra half an hour, you go to sleep and pick it back up or hear the highlights the next day. He compromised. Deal. Hermione grinned as Harry nodded enthusiastically. But if this happens again, we will be talking about using alarm wards to alert us when you leave your bedroom again, Cassiopeia added. It was usually used at the front door for intruders, but also by parents with young children or toddlers who liked to walk around if they woke up in the middle of the night. The twins blushed with nods as the elves popped breakfast up on the table: pancakes, bacon, scrambled eggs, fried bananas, maple syrup, chocolate syrup, whipped cream, strawberries, mango juice, and pumpkin juice. Now, Tom grinned as he filled his plate, watching Cassie and the twins do the same. Tell me about the book and match that were so wonderful you couldn't sleep. Hermione and Harry both lit up immediately, both launching into a tirade about their night, taking turns to describe their favorite twists and turns. Both Tom and Cassie turned their heads between their children back and forth as they swapped off talking and eating, somehow always aware of when they could have their turn. So remember to speak very clearly, Tom repeated for what felt like the 10th time in the last hour. Hermione snickered again, just like every other time. Maybe you can do it right this time, she teased Harry, laughing loudly as he scowled and pushed her. Enough. Tom groaned. Merlin, you too will be the reason I die. Imagine the article titles: The Great Lord Voldemort. Taken down by the stress of raising teenagers. You drama queen. Cassie rolled her eyes as she straightened Tom's collar and tie, kissing his cheek. All right. Does everyone have everything you need? She asked one last time, grinning when they nodded. All right, let's go. One by one the family entered the flow, shouting, Diagon Alley, as clearly as they could, shooting through the flow network, before finally bracing themselves as their feet hit the hearth of the fireplace, taking a slow and deliberate step forward into the flow corner of the leaky cauldron. Being far enough back T-tomers in the restaurant, next to the large brick wall that hid the entrance for Diagon Alley. Ha! Harry cried, jumping around to face Hermione landing in a crouch with finger guns. I told you I could do it. Yes, well done Harry, you accomplished one of the easiest means of magical transport. Hermione retorted dryly, patting his head, laughing when he pushed her hand off with an eye roll. All right, we have a lot to do. Cassiopeia interrupted the twins from developing further with a clap of her hands. First stop is Ollivanders, I suppose, she mused as she tapped her wand, and stepped back as the bricks slowly moved until they stood under a large archway at the top of Diagon Alley. Harry and Hermione looked at each other in excitement before moving forward, not waiting for their parents. They are practically vibrating, Tom whispered to Cassie as they walked behind their kids down the alley, watching them bounce lightly with each step. She laughed lightly, leaning in when Tom wrapped his arm around her waist. Can you believe they are 13 already? Cassie sighed. Where had the time gone? Before we know it they will be graduating or getting married. Tom shuddered in horror as they reached Ollivanders. All right. Let's do this. Tom grinned at Harry and Hermione, pushing the door inwards and allowing his children and wife in before closing the door behind him. As it closed he felt the privacy wards clamping down around them. The store was charmed to allow only groups or families that were together, inside at the same time. It wasn't polite for strangers to know anything about another's wand. It was taboo to ask or eavesdrop. Ah, the Leclercs, back I see. Ollivander's soft voice came from above them, the old man smiling widely as he slid down his rolling ladder, his pale blue eyes almost glowing in the gloomy atmosphere. What brings you back to me today? Ollivander asked with a smile, although the way he looked at you, it was like he knew all your secrets. Tom shuffled lightly, pushing his children in front of him. Somehow Ollivander had a gift for making you feel like an 11-year-old trying to find the perfect wand again. He suspected Ollivander knew who he was. The man never forgot a wand he had ever sold, And he was well practiced with feeling and knowing ambient magic. Being able to feel others' magic helped with finding a wand. They need focus stones, Tom spoke, pointing at Harry and Hermione. They turned 13, 4 days ago, and have blown something up or set something on fire every few hours while awake. Tom stressed the importance of needing focus stones to the wandmaker, who just smirked at him, amused. So they are just like yourself, aren't they, Tom? Ollivander chuckled, eyes glittering when he saw their shocked faces and Tom tensing. Of course, I know who you are, and no, I will not reveal it, but I will sign an oath contract after this if you so desire. You are a great wizard, Tom Riddle. You did terrible things when you lost yourself, but now you have a chance to be great again, and I want to be around for it. Cassie sighed in relief at the wizard's words, Tom just nodding stiffly. He would get an elf to send a contract for the man to sign. Ollivander turned to look at the two children before him. Hermione Riddle. Vine with a phoenix feather, 10 3/4 inches in length. Hartford Riddle. Holly with a phoenix feather, 11 inches in length. Ollivander grinned, good strong wands. I still remember the day I made them. It was shortly after your fall, Tom. Dumbledore had sent me a letter. He believed that because Fawkes' first feather was in your wand, the savior would need a core from the same bird. Of course, I tried to explain to him, that isn't how wands and wand crafting works. But he sent Fawkes in just the same, so I took a feather, but there was no way I could be prepared for what would happen. Harry and Hermione listened intently, having not heard this first time. Only that their wands were related to their fathers, who did great things, terrible, but great. Do you know how phoenixes breed? Ollivander asked in a seemingly non sequitur, barely pausing for an answer before he continued. While Fawkes was here lending a feather, looking quite old I must say, another phoenix flew in, a female. Tom gaped. Phoenixes were extremely rare. To have an eyewitness to two in the same area was almost unheard of. They seemed to know each other, nuzzling and hopping around. Then before my eyes, they had their burning day, right there, in front of me. I had heard about it, of course, but never thought I would be blessed enough to see it. That's how they breed, Tom said. When they are reborn in the ashes, a third hatching will be born. Wow, Hermione breathed, looking at her mother, who was also in awe. Harry's eyes widened as Ollivander nodded at Tom. They age rather quickly after a burning day. Within 3 days they were gone. Fawkes back to Hogwarts, and her, I suppose, back to wherever she came from. But a new hatchling will take 6 to 8 months before they can fly. So it stayed with me during that time, but one morning I woke up and the hatchling was nowhere to be found. But when I went to my crafting room, I found 2 feathers on the table. Those were our cores, weren't they? Harry asked as he gripped Hermione's shoulder in his hand as he looked up, grinning at his father. We literally have cores that come from the offspring of Father's core. Ollivander nodded. Whatever happened to the wand with Fawkes' other feather? Cassie asked with a tilt of her head. It's still here. Dumbledore and Mrs. Potter tried to make sure young Henry Potter got it, but nothing happened when he held it, no connection. It was not his wand, it would have never worked well for him, fighting him with every spell cast. But they ignored this at first. I had to summon it when they stupidly tried to leave with it. He frowned unhappily, eyes dark in anger. It was an insult to himself and his family to disregard the bond between a wand and its wizard. Now, Ollivander said, smiling once again as he clapped his hands twice and twisted his left hand slightly. Harry and Hermione grinned a look as a large pure glass case floated forward towards them. It was in the shape of a hexagonal prism, each line trimmed with gold. Once it was floating directly beside Ollivander. Gold legs sprouted out of the bottom to rest on the ground. They were used to such displays of powerful wandless and wordless magic. Their parents, aunts, and uncles were all capable of it, but many didn't bother training and practicing it, believing it was only for powerful wizards and witches. Dumbledore certainly helped that myth spread. Many Muggle-borns, as well as light half-bloods and purebloods, were awed when he used it. Who wants to go first? He asked, Harry's hand shooting into the sky before he could blink. Hermione rolled her eyes fondly. Do him first, he might die if he has to wait any longer, she snickered. Harry ignored her, grinning at Ollivander, too giddy to respond. So, a focus stone, Mr. Riddle, just like a wand chooses the witch or wizard, Ollivander said softly as he opened the case. Inside was every type of gemstone imaginable, laid out on a silver velvet lining. Harry's green eyes were wide in wonder as he looked over every stone. no two the same in shape, color or size. He could feel his magic already bubbling under his skin as he closed his eyes and stuck his right hand out. Although he was proficient in dueling with both hands due to his father's insistence on training, his right hand was still the more dominant hand. His hands hovered over the stones slowly, waiting to feel his magic to start a similar connection as he had felt with his wand. It wasn't long before the tugging at his core started. Opening his eyes, he slowly reached his hand towards an oval black stone with steel-gray streaks running around it. As he picked up, it was for him. A soft breeze of his magic wrapped around him. A soft gold glow engulfed his hand that was now clasping the stone, signifying the bond taking place. Harry could feel his core rejoicing. "Ah, a hematite!" Ollivander exclaimed gleefully, ignoring Tom's muttered, "Of course it is." Cassie elbowed her husband while looking at her son with pride and love. "This stone can come in black, steel gray, blood red, or any combination of the three. You, as you can see, have a black stone with gray marble lines." Ollivander went into lecture mode as he held out a gloved hand for the stone and wand. He never touched a bonded wand or stone without protection on his hands to prevent interference when he worked. He carefully transferred it to a lined velvet box, ready for taking into the workshop room once they were done here. With a smile, he turned around to explain further. "The hematite offers strong grounding energy on your wand and your core. It will help channel your focus, giving you clear thinking. It can also help soothe nerves when in use." Harry looked up at that, looking over to his father with a question in his eyes, but too unsure to ask. "Yes, Hartford, the hematite focus stone will help you to remain calm and keep your mind and magic focused when you are using your wand." Tom smiled as Harry brightened. He had always struggled with staying on task, and even when using magic could get distracted easily, causing simple spells to go awry. Ollivander smiled and nodded when the boy looked at him as well. Students with power enough to have accidental magic after getting a wand were rare. Still, with the focus stones, they could go on to have the most incredible control over their magic and do things others only dreamed of. "Your stone is large for focus stones as well," Ollivander commented. "At 13 mm by 10 mm, it is one of the bigger hematite stones that I have. It is a testament to the power you have within you." Harry smirked at that only to get an elbow to his gut. "Don't let it go to your head," Hermione snorted. Ollivander chuckled, and with a clap of his hands, he turned to face the other young Riddle. "So Miss Riddle, step forward." Ollivander smiled as she moved over to the golden glass display. She noticed the spot where Harry's hematite had laid. Another had taken its spot. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, nodding tightly before sticking out her left hand. She was, like her brother, able to use both hands, but her dominant hand was the opposite of Harry's. She relaxed, closing her eyes, and letting her magic out as she moved her hand slowly, waiting. She could feel herself getting anxious as she moved her hand over the stones with no reaction. Her shoulders had just tensed up when finally, she felt it. With a soft tugging at her core, she excitedly opened her eyes as she moved her hand some more, and there, right before the edge of the case, was a beautiful stone. It was purple and green, in an almost tie-dye style, blending in splotches. She picked it up gently, a large grin forming on her lips as she felt the bond slide into place with the same gold glow and mild breeze as Harry. "Fluorite?" Hermione grinned happily. "Yes." Ollivander nodded, impressed with her knowledge to recognize the stone so easily. "Exactly. I've read about it," Hermione continued as she ran her fingers over her stone. "The fluorite is most well known for creating stability in the core and mind of the witch or wizard it is bonded to, by boosting mental clarity, allowing mind peace. It is also known for helping with self-confidence and creating balance." "You are very well read, Miss Riddle," Ollivander praised as Hermione placed her wand and stone in a separate box from Harry's. Tom and Cassie beamed at their two children as they grinned at each other excitedly. "It is called by some, the genius stone," Ollivander added. "Those with a gift and thirst for knowledge are drawn to it. Your size is identical to your brother's. That is rare. I can only assume it is because of the strong bond your magic has to each other." Hermione blushed as Harry grinned at her and proclaimed of course she got that stone over any other one. "How long shall this take?" Tom asked Ollivander after congratulating his children. "I would say, half an hour for each wand," Ollivander nodded, looking at the boxes holding the focus stones and wands, feeling the powerful magic already at work. "I don't foresee any issues. They both bonded quite strongly with their stones and said stones seemed to be bonding with their wands already as well. "Thank you, Master Ollivander," Cassie smiled with a polite nod. "I shall send my private elf, Driscoll, with the contract," Tom added, feeling relief when Ollivander just simply nodded. "What's next, my love?" Tom asked Cassie, taking her hand as they exited the wand shop with Harry and Hermione right on their heels. "Might as well get the rest of the shopping for Hogwarts while we wait for the focus stones to be fused." Cassie smiled. "Maybe we could get some lunch while we are out as well." "Flourish and blots first?" Tom asked. "They have to get the new books for their electives." Harry and Hermione grinned in excitement, not only for their new subjects but for entering their favorite bookshop. Tom laughed as Harry and Hermione walked off without waiting for confirmation, heading straight for the green door just down the cobbled path. Flourish and Blots was packed, filled with students and their families shopping for the new school year. Thankfully, it wasn't as busy as last year when the moron Lockhart had been doing his signing, mostly because the useless witches and wizards who idolized him but had no reason to be at the bookshop weren't there. Harry and Hermione eyed the many shelves of books longingly as they were ushered up to the counters, but they knew they wouldn't be here long enough to just browse. Most parents weren't crazy enough to spend hours just browsing during the back-to-school rush, but thankfully for recreational reading, they could owl orders through the catalogs while at Hogwarts. The shop was chaotic with parents running after children determined to either get lost or destroy the book displays. Friends and families shouting over the noise and showing each other their hoards of books. Shop workers ran around after customers, finding books students couldn't find, ringing up the purchases and moving books and sets from the storage room to the correct displays. Harry found himself drumming his fingers on the counter in boredom, hating just standing around when he could be diving headfirst into the chaos and looking at the books, or he could be 2 doors down in quality Quidditch supplies. The newest broom, the Firebolt, had the prototype in the display window. Harry had been begging for one since the maker, Randolph Spudmore, had announced they were coming to the market at the beginning of the summer holidays. But his parents had stood firm against Harry's pleas. His Nimbus 2001 was still in mint condition and only a year old. "Ah, sorry to keep you waiting," a perky young brunette with large thin glasses and acne huffed as she ran up to the counter upon seeing them. "Hope you weren't up here long. How can I help you?" "We need 2 sets of the third-year core collection," Tom said quickly, the shop assistant nodding and with a wave of her wand, which was keyed into the store to summon what she needed. 2 sets of books all tied together dropped on the counter. Each set contained all the books needed for the third-year core classes. They hadn't gotten the set last year as some books are used for multiple years and theirs had still been in good condition. She then pulled out 2 simple black school satchels and placed the 2 sets inside them, the bags coming with the set as a new offer this year. Cassiopeia ran her hands over the bags and nodded, impressed with the quality. She would get the twins' names embroidered so the Black family crest as well. She knew it bothered Tom they couldn't wear the Slytherin crest yet. But hopefully, that will change soon. "Which electives are being taken this year?" the girl asked with a smile. The third year was the first year with electives, 5 to begin with. Care of magical creatures, ancient runes, arithmancy, divination, and Muggle studies. Then more electives were offered in the 5th, 6th and 7th years, such as warding, healing, apparition, alchemy, and magical law. 2 for care of magical creatures, 2 for ancient runes and 1 for arithmancy. Cassiopeia rattled off as she plucked 6 bookmarks from the counter's last-minute buy displays and added them to the books. The bookmarks were charmed to sit directly over the last line read and not move until the reader moved it, making for easy studying. The shop assistant nodded and with another wave of her wand, the needed books flew from the correct displays to land on the counter next to the sets of core books. 2 copies of Spellman's syllabary for ancient runes, which were bright red with gold writing and patterns on the front cover. 2 copies of the Monster Book of Monsters by Eduardus Lima for care of magical creatures, which had very acromantula appearances. Beady black eyes, sharp fangs and covered in the spider's type of fur, the name of which evaded Harry's memory. The books were nothing like Harry or Hermione had seen before, snarling and struggling against the ornate gold and leather belts holding them shut. And finally 1 copy of Numerology and Grammatica, which was 2 books combined into one by Loretta Wakefield and Mauricio Carnero. "Is there anything else I can help you with?" the assistant asked politely as she waved her wands and divided the books into the satchels with the core sets. "That will be all," Cassiopeia nodded shortly, pulling out a beautiful sleek green and silver coin purse. It had been a gift from her husband for her last birthday. It connected straight to the main family vault created for all their shared interests. This way her purse didn't jingle with the sounds of coins, and it was tied to her magic so no one else could use it to access their money. That comes to 25 galleons and 15 sickles, she chirped happily as she rang the total up, taking the money from Cassiopeia and counting it out as she placed it in the register. Thank you for shopping at Flourish and Blots, and I hope you have a great day. She smiled as she handed the satchels over to Harry and Hermione. Thank you, the twins chorused, Tom and Cassie nodding politely before ushering their children out of the chaos. The young book assistant groaned when she heard the current manager stick his hand into the large cage holding the monster book of monsters again and shouting out curses. He was an idiot and she wasn't sure how he had become manager, honestly. Why he never used the store's locked summoning charms she couldn't understand. They were keyed into the wards to be the only ones able to use the charm in the store to keep them from having to run around constantly. But she used it more than ever once the blasted monster book arrived. Nonetheless, she rushed over to help him and to try and calm down the parents now looking furious at him cursing in front of the children nearby. Chapter 2 Chapter Notes. A new chapter. Hey everyone, I am super stoked to have this ready for you guys. It has been good to be back writing and having a flow going. As always, enjoy, let me know what you think and let me know what you want to see more of. Mermaid XOXO. See the end of the chapter for more notes. Tom looked over the shopping list with relief. They had almost everything. With a tired sigh, he led his family over to the final stop in Diagon Alley. The building was an old one, made of faded purple bricks with 4 large dark green wooden paneled windows, and a long sign crossed over the middle with the golden letters declaring Magical Menagerie. All right, try not to get distracted, Tom sighed as Harry and Hermione perked up seeing where they were. We're here for care products for Hedwig and Aristotle only. He yelled out the last part as they disappeared into the store without listening. Why'd I try? He asked his wife with a shake of his head, smiling when Cassie just laughed airily. You know, despite not having any contact with him before last year, they do remind me of Sirius so often. His excitement for everything, his love of animals, of Quidditch and pranks. She said as they entered the building, only to hear, even above all the animal noises, Harry and Hermione cooing over everything they had found. Yes, well, as much as the mutt would deny it, he has many things in common with Bellatrix and yourself, and not only are you a dedicated and involved mother, but Bella has also been a big part of their lives as their aunt, since the first day we bought them home. Tom nodded. It amused him to no end how much Sirius Black denied the black in him, and if the dog Animagus ever proved himself trustworthy enough to their side, he would enjoy watching the reunion of the 2 most chaotic blacks alive. Cassie laughed, slapping his chest lightly, knowing exactly why he was smirking. Sirius and Bella's explosive fights, and the bizarre and outrageous pranks on each other had been legendary growing up. Both were determined to be the best and denied they were anything like each other. And until the split divided half the family, they had also had a very tight bond, always the first to defend each other against others despite also being the first to lay blame on each other. Bella had been devastated by Sirius' fallout with the family, and she had hated her Aunt Walburga with all of her magic until the witch died. Many of the remaining Black family and inner circle friends long suspected that Bella had a wand in Walburga's death. Of course, there was never any evidence of foul play behind Walburga's heart-stopping, but if anyone would have been able to pull off murdering the Black matriarch without evidence, it would be Bellatrix. Why don't you try and wrangle our spawn, while I track down what we actually come in here for, Cassie said fondly, kissing Tom's cheek before disappearing into the rows of animal care equipment. Tom watched her leave until he couldn't see her anymore before listening out for his wayward children's voices and following them. He found Hermione first, up the front with one of the store's workers talking animatedly, clearly holding something blocked from Tom's view. As he got closer, he groaned loudly, clenching his eyes tight and pinching his nose in the hopes he was wrong. No, he said immediately, absolutely not. He shook his head fervently after opening his eyes back open as Hermione grinned at him while turning around to look at him. In her arms was the ugliest ginger cat he had ever seen. Not happening, he denied, sneering at the large fluff ball that was eyeballing him. Judging by the squashed face, large size, lion-like mane around its face and the ambient magic he could feel, it was at least half Kneasel. But Dad, Hermione whined, happily nuzzling her face into the demon's. Tom groaned as the blasted thing purred and nuzzled her back. He could feel the magic from both the creature and his daughter tightening around them. They were bonding. It was her magical familiar. He knew it was coming home with them. Not only was it extremely dangerous to even try and separate a bonded familiar and their witch or wizard, but with the joy he could feel coming from Hermione right now, he didn't know if he would have been able to make her leave it here even if they hadn't had a witch-familiar bond. Fucking hell, he swore, only to smile when Hermione squealed as he nodded reluctantly. All right. Let's find out what it needs, Tom sighed, glaring at the ginger menace, who dared to hiss at him as Hermione passed him. The demon's yellow eyes stared Tom down as Hermione thanked her his name as Crookshanks. Hermione chirped. Of course it is, Tom said dully, the young worker giving him an apologetic look before darting after Hermione as she called for his help, leading her to all the things she would need. He couldn't believe he was going to have a cat in his home. This was a disaster. He had sworn he would never have one after spending 7 years at Hogwarts sharing a dorm with Ralston Lestrange's monster. Jezebel. That demonic thing had been evil incarnate. And he was Voldemort. She hated everyone that wasn't Ralston and would actively hiss and try to attack those who got too close to her or her human. He shuddered, remembering the time Jezebel had attacked him for simply sticking his hand under his own bed trying to find a gray and black button sweater. Unaware she was happily sleeping on said sweater under the bed until his hand startled her. Even with magic, it had been incredibly painful to heal. There you are. Cassie's sweet voice interrupted his memories. Blinking his eyes, he brought himself back to the present, his vision focusing on his wife. Her thick curls were loose today, making her look more like her elder sister Bellatrix than ever. Although Bella's hair was as dark as ink while Cassie's was honey blonde, darker at the roots. Her gray eyes sparkled with love as she looked at her husband with a soft smile on her peach lips. You okay, Tom? She asked, eyes furrowing in worry. Tom chuckled and nodded. Yes, dear. Everything is fine. He leaned over and pulled her in tight with a kiss on her forehead. Although I do regret to inform you that our daughter has found her familiar. Oh yes, I am aware, Cassie chuckled. Hartford was most excited to inform me when I found him with his arms full of toys and bags of treat biscuits. Tom groaned. Of course, his son was going overboard for his sister's familiar. She had done the same for Harry when he had bonded with Hedwig just before their first year. When they had agreed to get Harry and Hermione an owl for their first year at Hogwarts, never had he expected that Harry would find his familiar in a rare snowy owl. It is a blessing from magic to find your familiar, Cassie smiled softly, leaning into her husband. I know, Tom nodded. I am so happy she has found hers. She never showed it or acted out in jealousy when Harry found Hedwig, but I do believe she has been waiting for her turn ever since. Why did it have to be a cat? Tom whined, which he would deny, causing Cassie to throw her head back as she laughed, shaking her head in amusement, hair flying wild. You will live, my dear, she consoled insincerely with a grin before she saw Harry making his way towards them. Arms full of things for Crookshanks stacked high enough the poor boy couldn't see in front of him. Cassie snorted before heading over to guide her blind son to the counter. Tom groaned as he headed outside. Merlin, he could use a fire whiskey. Do you really need this much stuff? He heard Cassie ask their son skeptically. Yes, mother. Harry sighed with exasperation just as Tom stepped out into the crisp autumn air, the rest of his son's reply lost as the store door closed. Today couldn't end soon enough. It was after 2 in the afternoon when they finally arrived home. Thank Merlin for shrinking charms, they made school shopping that much easier. Bags and bags filled the foyer, as Tom and Cassie unshrunk them before passing them off to Pippin and Cinnamon to put away for their charges. Harry and Hermione were useless as they fawned over the new family member. Even Hedwig was sitting on Harry's head cooing at the damn thing. At least they had gotten everything they needed for the new year at Hogwarts from Diagon Alley before moving to Horizont Alley, which branched off Diagon at Gringotts. They stopped to eat at Heliotropium, a popular grey and dark friendly restaurant, run by the Pusey family. Hermione and Harry had eagerly fed little chunks of chicken to Crookshanks, who purred loudly in his lavish cat carrier. Velvet cushions, a hidden expansion charm on the inside, and one side of the carrier was made of just scratching post material. A water and food bowl with stabilizing charms. Harry had even slipped in 3 of the 20 toys he had bought the cat. Why don't you two go and get Crookshanks settled in? Cassie encouraged, handing Harry the 2 bags from Magical Menagerie while Hermione carried Crookshanks in one arm and his carrier in the other. The twins hurried up the stairs, with Hedwig flying behind them, chattering away about where Crookshank's bed should go, as well as his food and water bowls. Thankfully, with all the wards around the property, and the small cat doors they would have installed, Crookshanks would be able to go outside whenever he pleased. Whether he needed to go to the toilet or simply play and explore, he wouldn't be able to accidentally leave the property or get lost. "Come on, dear," Cassie hummed as she steered her husband into the small first-floor study that they often used when it was just the 2 of them. Tom sighed in relief as he sunk into his favorite Chesterfield armchair. It was wider than average armchairs and extremely soft with a supportive seat and back. Covered entirely in a beautiful sapphire velvet, the feet and frame were made of robust black timber. Cassiopeia had a smaller version, identical to Tom's in everything but size. They rested together, not quite side by side, not yet opposite each other. A small round coffee table between them, made of the same black timber as the furniture. On the other side of the room were a matching 2-seater and a 3-seater couch. Tom's elf Driscoll popped in quietly with Master Tom's favorite goblin-made whiskey. It was extremely expensive and one of the comforts he splurged on. After pouring his master the glass, he moved quickly to drag the matching ottoman over to Tom's feet so he could rest them after the long shopping trip. "Thank you, Driscoll," Cassie said softly as she sat down in her chair, pouring herself a glass of iced lemon water from the ever-present jug. Magic kept it fresh, clean and cold, and all of her most common haunts of the manor had one. "Oh, Driscoll, before I forget, can you take an identity contract to Ollivanders before the day is done?" Tom spoke, sipping his whiskey happily. "Of course, Master Tom," Driscoll nodded. After being assured they didn't need anything else, he popped off to take care of his master's contracts. They were serious business. No one could cause any mishaps for Driscoll's family with them. He was also the only elf in Riddle Manor trusted to take care of such important documents. Master Tom also had made it clear if anyone resisted signing, he could use any means to protect them. He smiled darkly at the contract. He had never been allowed to use his elf magic freely before Master Tom, let alone on human magicals. But the Riddle family weren't like any others. Master Tom had killed his first owner, Margot Podmore. She had been a member of the Order of the Phoenix with her brothers Sturgis and Everett. Yet no one else knew how twisted the woman was, the black alchemy of the family. She had once wanted to abandon the light in her family, having fallen in love with a Slytherin. Unfortunately, her precious Benny had no idea who she was. During their time at Hogwarts together, he had never laid eyes on the lithe Gryffindor following him around. Had never spoken to the red-headed girl who imagined him beside her pouring his heart out for only her. She had only joined her brothers as a member of the Order in hopes it would help to enact revenge. Revenge on a man who had no idea the danger watching him when he married his beloved betrothed. She had tried many times to kill the disgusting raven-haired witch who had stolen her soulmate. She had gotten close once, breaking the bitch's spine during a raid on Diagon Alley. Unfortunately for Margot, before she could finish it, the blasted woman's brothers and Benny the brothers apparating their wounded sister out of Diagon. But Benny himself had then turned on her. In the end, she had been so blinded by his betrayal that she had been stupid enough to target his 2-year-old son, Marcus. The attack ended up being her downfall. Every dark or neutral pureblood had blood wards protecting their bedrooms, plus a layering of charms and runes that would only allow chosen cores to enter nurseries. Benjamin and Regina Flint had tortured the woman for days for her attempt on their son's life, being careful to keep her just sane enough to be able to pass information of the Order to their lord. Once he had extracted all he could, he executed her in front of the entire inner circle. With her death, her elves' bond broke. Most elves would be left to a family member or friend in a will. But being so sure of her future with Benjamin Flint after she killed Regina, she had never written one. Meaning the elves were free. They had a few choices. They could stay free, find the Podmore brothers, find a new family, or pledge themselves to the man who had killed their abusive master. To the hurt and exhausted elves, there was only one answer for them. Driscoll had been amazed at how different things were with the Dark Lord and his Death Eaters. Even with his new master spiraling deeper into the war and creating more Horcruxes, he never regretted the decision to follow him. But now, they had Master Tom back. Voldemort was gone, mostly, and there wasn't anything Driscoll wouldn't do for his Master Tom. The next day was quiet and calm with an overcast sky. It was just gone 10 in the morning when Tom had finished up with the last of his paperwork and sent it off to Manager Bleak. She had become his family affair and account manager 2 years before he had found and adopted Harry and Hermione. She had been recommended by Tom's previous manager Lodel, who was Bleak's aunt and also the one who had trained her. He had been sad to say goodbye to Lodel, but she was ready for retirement. Manager Bleak had helped forge the papers for Cassiopeia and himself to be the biological parents of Harry and Hermione. She had also worked with her brother, Slatek, to create his new identity of Dion Thomas Leckler, and it was finally done. They had finished with all the paperwork and secured a solid background that couldn't be pulled apart by anyone. Tom was officially able to take the lordship of both Slytherin and Peverell, just in time for him to attend the first Wizengamot meeting of the year. Tom sighed. Finally, he pushed back his large ornate Victorian chair back from the matching desk. The set was made from dark brown mahogany wood with intricate designs carved into the framework in lace-like patterns. He had 2 of these chairs, and he had them handmade, along with the desk years ago. One chair was here in his private office, and the other he used at the head of the table for Death Eater meetings. They were large. The top of the backrest was several inches above his head when sitting down, and the Slytherin crest was proudly carved into the top rail. The emerald green leather that made up the back support cushion was tufted with buttons, and the seat cushion was the same green leather, although untufted. Cassie called it his vanity throne, but he disagreed, maintaining it was just simply a nice chair. But for now, it was time to track down his wayward children. They were eagerly awaiting him to finish off his work this morning. Not only were they finally 13, but they also had focus stones in their wands as of yesterday. That only meant one thing to the excitable children of the Dark Lord Voldemort: the unforgivables. Their mother hadn't wanted them to begin training with the 3 unforgivables until they were 15 or even 17. Tom had wanted them to learn earlier, at 10, with their training wands. Finally, they had compromised at 13. Tom had been annoyed when at age 15, he went on holiday with the Lestranges, the Blacks and the Averys, and discovered his housemates had been training to use them since they were 12 or 13. It had only shown him, yet again, how big the gap in learning could be for Muggle-born or Muggle-raised. But being the prodigy he was, he had cast it successfully before the holidays were over, and he was a master before he turned 17. Even Cassius Avery, who was the eldest of the group on holiday, had been 19 and didn't have complete and total control over all 3 unforgivables. Cassiopeia, on the other hand, had been 19 before she had been allowed to even try the practical side of the unforgivables. Her father, Cygnus III, had kept her as sheltered as he could. Not only had she been a late-in-life baby, a miracle in the eyes of her father, who had adored her, but after Druella had threatened Cygnus with Cassie's life if he undermined her decision to disown Andromeda, he cherished his youngest even more. Once Druella had passed away from an accidental and stray curse during a fight in a Death Eater meeting. He had done everything in his power to keep Cassiopeia as the innocent child he felt he had failed to protect in his eldest 3. He hadn't been able to thank Rodolphus for taking the shot and doing what he should have done many years ago. Father. Harry was on his feet within seconds of seeing his father enter the parlor where he had been reading and replying to the latest letters from Fred Weasley, his Gryffindor soulmate. Hermione raised her head from the tea she had been enjoying with her mother. "How did it go?" Cassiopeia asked her husband, grinning in response to the wide smile that crossed Tom's lips. "Perfectly," he purred. "I just sent off the last of papers. I shall be claiming my birthright at the first Wizengamot meeting of the year." He laughed as Harry and Hermione cheered, and Cassie got up to kiss his cheek. "I am so proud of you," she breathed. "I am just glad it is done. I had never thought it would take as much time and effort as it had." But Manager Bleak was thorough, not leaving anything to chance. Tom nodded, kissing his wife, ignoring the disgusted ew from his son. "And you too, next summer you shall be attending with me as my heirs," he added, looking at Harry and Hermione, who bounced with excitement. Every summer, the heir of every lordship aged 11 or older could attend the Wizengamot meeting to watch and learn from the current lord, lady or family proxy. Their cousin Draco and their heir or heiress friends had been attending since they turned 11, so Harry and Hermione had been waiting not so patiently for their turn. "But we can discuss that closer to the time," Tom smiled. "I am now free, and just like we promised, your mother and I shall begin the practical side of learning the unforgivable curses." "Run ahead," Cassie encouraged her children. "We have the training room all set up. I shall go and retrieve our guests." She grinned wickedly, making Tom groan as her gray eyes sparkled darkly. She had no idea what she did to him. "Tom!" She squealed as he wrapped his arms around her waist and nuzzled his nose into her neck, pressing himself up against her back and pulling her in tightly. "Do you know how gorgeous you are when you embrace and delight in the darkness and malice inside of you?" he asked huskily, kissing her hand lightly, moving up her arm until finally giving a bite where the neck met her shoulder. "Oh no, mister," she giggled, "if I let you get started we would be here for ages, and our children would impatiently come looking for us and be scarred for life." "We can afford a mind healer for them," Tom joked, but he took a step back and took a breath to steady himself. "Are you all right to get our guests while I get Hartford and Hermione ready?" he asked. "Of course," Cassie grinned, kissing his cheek lightly. "Maybe we can continue this afterwards," she teased breathily as she passed her husband, making her way to the basement-turned-dungeon. Humming to herself ate her way out of the parlor. Feeling Tom's eyes on her until she turned the corner, she smiled with happiness, continuing her journey past the dining hall, where at the end of the hall she could see the large and heavy dark brown oak door. It was then that she felt a presence join her, a large shadow of a bumbling and gentle man darting across the walls as he hurried to join her. "Mistress Cassie," he called breathlessly as he chased after her. With a grin she stopped to turn to him. He was a short man, only a few inches taller than Harry and Hermione despite being 33 years old to their 13. He was also a rather plump man overall, his chubby cheeks always pink with excitement and his small blue eyes were almost beady in appearance. His dark blonde receding hair reached his shoulders. It had been brushed and pulled back into a low ponytail with a rather large blue bow. Most likely a gift from Harry, who loved them, but also enjoyed playing with and styling everyone's hair, having started helping Hermione young. "Peter dear, I do wish you would call me just Cassie," she sighed with loving amusement. "You need not call me mistress, or call Tom master, we are family." "Oh, I couldn't do that, mistress," Peter Pettigrew squeaked, almost in horror at the suggestion, shaking his head. "Master Tom is our leader, he showed me the truth and has kept me safe. You are Master Tom's heart and so kind, so must be treated with the same respect." Cassie just smiled and hugged the man, knowing it was a lost battle. She watched as his watery eyes darted around the hallways, always alert and checking for dangers, hands wringing in anxiety. "We are safe in here," she promised, knowing sometimes he just needed to hear reassurances. "We checked on all the property wards just 2 days ago." Peter nodded happily before relaxing slightly, although after everything it seemed like he never truly relaxed fully. The poor animagus had been through hell during the war, and Cassie couldn't wait to get her hands on those responsible for destroying someone who had been so innocent and joyful. It filled a fire in her stomach as she thought about it, her hands clenching, aching to hold her wand as she cursed Dumbledore and Moody. During the height of the Wizarding War, when Voldemort was at his most unstable and unpredictable, Dumbledore started to become desperate. The monster he had created with Myrtle's death and that first Horcrux had gone too far, gotten too powerful, and Dumbledore was no longer in control. It was obvious to the masses that the Light and the Ministry were losing this war. Everyone was scared, many were reaching out to Dumbledore, begging for him to do something, anything. Everyone looked to the headmaster, expecting him to finish Voldemort like he had Grindelwald. The letters had started to turn into howlers. The wizarding world was losing their faith, reverence and respect for him. He knew he had to hatch a new plan, and fast. One of the reasons they had been losing was that the dark was always 2 wands ahead. With spies inside Hogwarts, students and teachers alike in the Ministry, from the Department of Magical Games and Sports to the Department of Mysteries, and the Department of Magical Law and Enforcement. He had loyal followers in the Order Department. Many trainees were just graduated students he had recruited for the Order of the Phoenix. But it wasn't enough, and so he decided he needed a spy inside the Death Eaters themselves. Not only would the spy be able to pass vital information about Voldemort's plans back to Dumbledore, but they might even be able to find out the identities of the inner and outer circle members. He knew of many ex-students that were sure to be marked, however, because of their high standing among pureblood circles and the Wizengamot. With only his word to go on, the Aurors couldn't or wouldn't do anything. There were also so many Death Eaters and supporters that even he couldn't know all of their identities. Whispers of Voldemort recruiting powerful Ministry workers and leaving them unmarked to stay hidden had reached his ears as well. He knew his spy couldn't be just anyone. The Dark would never trust one of his most loyal and devoted, but it also couldn't be someone who questioned him often. There would be sacrifices made to gain trust, and that ruled out some of his followers who didn't have the stomach for that. The spy also couldn't be someone who could fight Dumbledore's influence, just in case he needed to use it, or be weak-willed enough to convert to the dark while undercover. That was when it hit him. Peter Pettigrew. The headmaster had never really paid attention to the boy when he had been in school, disregarding him as just a little follower who had managed to befriend the three he was more interested in: James Potter, Sirius Black, and Remus Lupin, the Golden Boys of Gryffindor, although he had been pleasantly surprised when Peter had actually managed the animagus transformation. But now all four boys had graduated from Hogwarts and were ready to prove their worth to the old headmaster. James and Sirius had applied to the Auror recruitment program, which due to the war had fast-tracked the students in just a year and a half instead of the original 3 years. Remus was tasked with tracking down werewolves who had not publicly sided with Voldemort and ran under Fenrir Greyback. It was dangerous work trying to convince every unaligned pack or solo wolf to either side with Dumbledore or at the least stay neutral. It wasn't easy, with Voldemort and Greyback vowing to change the restrictive and prejudiced laws against dark creatures. But Peter hadn't been able to prove himself on missions yet, and Dumbledore could see it eating at him when his friends were showered in praise for their successes. It didn't help that they also had it easier than Peter socially. James and Sirius were ever the popular and fun ones, whereas Remus always seemed to know just what to say in times of good and bad. James had just proposed to Lily Evans, who had said yes joyfully. Sirius was happily bouncing from casual partner to casual partner, and Remus had just recently started dating Emmeline Vance. Peter was left to just flounder about, stuttering when faced with a pretty girl and saying the wrong thing. That slight jealousy was what Dumbledore used to lure Peter into the trap that the undercover mission was. The plan had been simple, even a gnome could follow it, Dumbledore had thought. To begin with, Peter was to start pulling away from the Order and his friends. It was vital. They didn't know why, though. They couldn't afford an accidental or purposeful leak, so the only wizards aware of the plan were Dumbledore, Peter, and Dumbledore's second-in-command, Senior Auror Alistair, Mad Eye, Moody. The stout and grouchy Auror was one of the most competent Aurors the department had ever seen. He was quick and vicious, often using extremely questionable methods to get the job done. Most of the Death Eaters that were dead or in Azkaban were there because of Moody. He never gave mercy, and he never gave second chances. With no chance of their plan escaping from any loose or drunk lips, the second thing they had to do was stop Peter himself from revealing what he was up to. So Dumbledore and Moody spent hours using legilimency and occlumency to painfully build up a mental shield in Peter's mind, as they didn't have the time to train Peter to be able to do it himself. Not that they believed he could learn anyway. He ended up spending 2 weeks in a makeshift hospital wing in Dumbledore's office to recover when they were done. Thankfully, because of the generous use of the Obliviate, none of the Medowitches and wizards remembered any of it. Next, Peter was to be seen by the right people hanging out in their pubs. Mostly this was down Nocturne Alley, as it had become a hub for Death Eaters. Slowly he would gain the trust of low-level sympathizers and recruiters, which was easier than they had planned. Peter pretended scared about the war, using chosen phrases like, "How the light would lose the war," and "No one in the Order respects or trusts him," and as he settled in, adding, "It's not like the dark is actually wrong anyway, and I will show them all." It had all worked perfectly. Within a few weeks, Peter had made friends with the recruiters, who Peter would then pass on valuable information. Just like in chess, Dumbledore wasn't afraid to sacrifice a few pawns to win, so if a few Order members had to die for Peter to get the dark mark, then so be it. Of course, Peter had no idea that the information he was repeating was reasonable for the deaths of his friends and their families. He would have pulled out and told everyone if he had known. But they had done it. It took 4 seemingly long months. Still, before they knew it, Peter was standing before Voldemort pledging his allegiance, taking part in his initiation, and finally receiving the dark mark. He continued to pass vital information to Dumbledore. They were gaining the upper hand. Peter was proving himself to Voldemort as the dark spy, and moving up the ranks. It was March 1980, and Peter had been promoted from Death Eater to an Outer Circle Death Eater. It was the very next day after the Death Eaters had celebrated his promotion, that everything came crashing down around them. He had raced to Hogwarts to the headmaster's office, excited to tell Dumbledore about making it to the Outer Circle, which gave him several new identities. He burst into the room unaware that Dumbledore had been in the middle of a job interview with Sybil Trelawney. Peter had arrived just in time to hear the damning prophecy. Chapter end notes. Ha ha ha, yes, a cliffhanger. I couldn't help myself. Don't hate me, tears of joy. Chapter 3 chapter notes. Here is the new chapter, everyone. Now, for those who aren't aware, I do have a Facebook for everything relating to this FIC series. Feel free to friend me at Remade. Someone reported ReusableMermaid as a fake name. Like, why? My profile pic is of a mermaid reading a book. I have pictures of characters, and other things I think are fun or important. I also try and keep everyone updated on where I am with the next updates when I can. Please enjoy. See the end of the chapter for more notes. Peter stood there horrified as the woman in the old moss green, tree brown and dark orange clothes paired with large praying mantis glasses finished her prophecy. Dumbledore was quick to stun her, and raced to the large pensive to the left of the room. Pulling out his wand, he swiftly placed the memory inside. Many had underestimated the rat animagus, including the headmaster before him. Still, he had been able to keep up with his 3 friends for years, graduate with O's and E's, and become an illegal animagus at 15. Dumbledore sat back down, peering up at Peter with calculating eyes. As Peter stared back and locked eyes with Dumbledore, he pieced everything together and knew there were only a few children who would fit the prophecy. Born to those who have thrice defied him, not many had lived to defy the Dark Lord once, let alone 3 times. But there were 3 couples that Peter could think of off the top of his head who had done so and were also expecting children. They were all Order members. James and Lily Potter. Warner and Heather Bones. Marlene McKinnon and Dorcas Meadows. Born as the 7th month dies, well, that knocked off the McKinnon Meadows child. Marlene was only just 2 months pregnant and wasn't due until late September or early October. Unfortunately, the Potters and Bones had been given late July and early August due dates. And the Dark Lord will mark him as his equal, but he will have power the Dark Lord knows not. A boy. That removed the Bones child. Just last week they had had it confirmed that they were expecting a daughter. They had announced it at an Order meeting, saying they wanted to name her Susan. Fuck, that left James and Lily's twin boys. No, this couldn't be happening, he thought as his mind swirled. And either must die at the hand of the other, for neither can live while the other survives. Oh, Merlin, one of those 2 innocent babies was expected to defeat the Dark Lord. How could anyone expect a child to do what grown witches and wizards couldn't do? Surely they couldn't wait for the child to grow up? The war would go on for years? He had to tell James and Lily. Peter opened his mouth to say something, anything, and started moving his legs to jump to his feet, and that was the last thing he remembered. Everything else came in strange images, broken scenes. He watched as he continued to pass messages between the 2 groups. He watched the world helplessly, floating through each day with no control. Unable to stop himself from telling Lord Voldemort about the prophecy, unable to make himself tell James, Sirius or Remus. He watched in horror as just 2 months later, Dorcas and a 4-month pregnant Marlene were brutally murdered in front of him. He was frozen, unable to do anything. They screamed for him to help, and they died thinking their friend betrayed them. A pregnant Emma Yaxley née Fenwick was next. Despite whatever was controlling him, Peter had been able to throw up when he overheard her brothers, Benji and Robbie, bragging about doing it themselves to Lily, along with Frank and Alice Longbottom. The next flash he had was the party the Death Eaters had thrown when Benji and Robbie Fenwick had paid the price. Emma's husband Corbin Yaxley and his friends Antonin Dolohov, Walden McNair, and Rodolphus Lestrange had been bloodthirsty in their revenge. He watched as little Henry and Harry were born on the 31st of July, just half an hour before midnight. The Order celebrated joyously over the new arrivals. The adorable little boys brought some light into the dark days. But he saw Dumbledore grinning at the boys whenever he saw him, his blue eyes twinkling. Peter then watched himself agreeing to become the secret keeper for James and Lily. Why wouldn't he? They were his best friends and the boys needed to be kept safe. He knew Sirius was the better choice. He was in danger of being discovered inside the Death Eaters, but he shrugged it off. They wanted him. He wouldn't fight their logic. Then the worst happened. Against every fight he gave, Peter gave Voldemort the secret. He watched in dismay as the Dark Lord entered the Potter cottage where James and Lily hid with Henry and Harry. He couldn't do anything. But they lived. Somehow they had lived and Voldemort had fallen. Then he was on the run. Sirius and James were hunting him for giving Voldemort the secret. As a rat, he hid in the sewers. He didn't know what day it was. The strange hold on him was as strong as ever. It was breaking him. Every day he was fighting the voice telling him to die. He wanted to. He had betrayed his best friends, his family, the only ones in the world he cared about. But there was a fight in him, a small whisper telling him that something was wrong. He would never have done this. He tried to stop it but he couldn't. Something bigger was at play. He survived on desperation alone, fighting just to eat. Finally, he had weakened the strange hold on him enough to get to the Malfoy Manor. If anyone could help him, could figure out what was going on with him, it was the Black Sisters. He didn't know what it was, but he knew he couldn't trust those in the Order. He didn't blame James, Sirius and Remus. All they knew was he had betrayed them, and they were hot-headed. He wasn't sure if they would pause long enough to listen. Once everything was fixed, yes, then he would find them. But he knew for sure everything had changed in Dumbledore's office. So he had to take the chance on the opposing side. Bellatrix Lestrange née Black was crazy. She was medicated for the Black Madness, but her mother had caused a lot of damage to her to top it all off. But even if he wanted her, he wouldn't know where to start looking after she had broken out of Azkaban. Andromeda, although weary of Dumbledore, she strongly opposed Voldemort, and Peter didn't know her enough to risk being turned in. He had passed her home once, watching her and her husband playing in the garden with their young daughter. But he had moved on quickly. Cassiopeia was young and sweet. She had also been suspected to be an unmarked Death Eater. But he had never seen her at any meetings or interacted with her outside of when James and Sirius picked fights with her best friends. But Narcissa had been a loyal supporter, unmarked, and also she was married to one of Voldemort's most trusted. She had always been kind to Peter when he had been undercover, and was a gifted healer for all Death Eaters, especially for those who failed Voldemort or came up against the Order. But the reason he felt he could trust her the most was he had taken a cutting hex from Caradoc Dearborn meant for her. She had been leaving St. Mungo's with a fretful Lucius. At 5 months pregnant, Narcissa had gone into premature labor. They had succeeded in stopping the labor, only for them to be attacked on the doorsteps. Saving the life of someone else could create a strong bond of trust in their magic, and they would be compelled to return the favor. And he hadn't saved just her, but the Malfoy heir. Magic didn't forget, and neither did a mother. In the end, Peter was incredibly thankful that he had made the right choice heading to Malfoy Manor. Lucius and Narcissa had been horrified at his malnourished state. Narcissa was quick to send Lucius to Severus for a list of potions that unfortunately she hadn't restocked in their own house yet. Severus had come back with Lucius to help, determined to find out why Peter had betrayed the Potters, or specifically Lily. They were utterly disgusted when the routine healing uncovered an unbelievable amount of dangerous controlling spells on the poor man. There was damage to his liver and core that was only done by an illegal controlling potion. Imperium Summa. The same potion Dumbledore had given to Tom all those years ago. So potent that even a single dose was damaging. It took 5 agonizing months to cleanse Peter of all of Dumbledore's control, and that was just physical. Mentally, Peter still struggled with everything that had happened. Thankfully, his mind healer was wonderful and insisted she was available whenever he needed her. It had been another few weeks before they informed Peter of everything. How Dumbledore killed Tom's soulmate and how he created Voldemort. Peter had been furious at the lies he had believed for so long, especially after meeting a fully sane Tom. He had struggled to understand what had happened when he was reintroduced to Harry. This tiny little 6-year-old stared up at him with recognition in those bright green eyes, chirping out a wormy with a toothy grin. He looked more like a pint-sized Cassie than James now, his sister looking like her father. It had warmed his heart how Hermione had trusted him just because Harry had. But how could his old friend discard his child? Just because they thought Henry had defeated Voldemort. It filled a fury inside him. He had wanted to confront James and Lily, but he had a hard road before him. His extreme anxiety made it hard to relax or leave the homes of those he did trust. Although with the Aurors still looking for him, it wasn't like he could go down the road or shopping at Diagon Alley anyway. He suffered nightmares and flashbacks more than he wished. Thankfully, the potion regime he was on and his mind healer did help with that. But he was grateful for this newfound family, the dark taking him in despite learning of his early subterfuge. He watched Harry and Hermione grow, and before he could blink they were ready for their first year at Hogwarts. That had been hard, knowing the 2 children he loved were going to be going to the school run by Dumbledore. He had been horrified when they had then insisted on using the last name Riddle instead of Black. But the weekly letters settled him. as well as the knowledge of what Tom would do if they even suspected Harry and Hermione were in danger. "I have checked on them every day," Peter squeaked, his happy and mischievous giggle pulling Cassie out of the memories. Peter's nose twitched as he smiled and tapped his middle finger and thumb together in a familiar stim to relax and ground himself. They walked together down the long hall, towards the large gray door at the end. "Been making sure they're very comfortable," he continued with a scratch to his philtrum. "Mipsy and Tobble have been very helpful as well." He added absently, the two elves were wonderful additions to Peter's life. They had been given to Peter by Tom, to help him with day-to-day life, as an attempt to try and make up for everything that had happened. They helped Peter daily, from the small things like reminding the animagus to eat and take his potions, to help him complete tasks given by Tom once he was strong enough to help the dark once again. "Very good," Cassiopeia praised as they reached the door. It was heavy and creaked loudly as she pushed it open. It was charmed heavily to only allow Tom, Cassie, Peter and the elves to open it. "Thank you, I am grateful you trusted me with such an important task," Peter rushed out, embarrassed to be so excited, but also too happy he had been given a chance to not say anything. "I knew you could do it," Cassie grinned as they made their way down the concrete stairs into the darkness, her heels clacking soundly in the train of her blood-red acromantula silk robe sliding down behind them. "No one else I would trust," she added as they came to a slow stop at the last stair. She stepped down onto the concrete floor, and for a moment they were encased in pure darkness. Peter let himself relax, knowing he wouldn't be able to see his hand if he held it right in front of his face. It was peaceful. In the dark, you had to rely on your other senses, and he was well practiced at it. Sitting in the dark and just breathing, feeling your magic dance around you. It was because of this that he could feel Cassie's every move, and as if they were in the light, he could see what she was doing in his head. A delicate twitch of her left wrist caused her wand to drop down from the forearm holster and into her hand, then a sharp wave of the said wand and suddenly all the torches lining the walls lit up. The orange flames illuminated the large dungeons of Riddle Manor. The open space before them stretched out below the ballroom, entrance foyer and dining room on the ground floor. The walls were made of stacked concrete bricks, cold and uneven, offering no comfort to those who lay against them. Black metal bars were bolted into the bricks and floor, creating 12 cells, 6 on each of the left and right walls, forming a passageway down the middle from the bottom of the stairs. The dungeons had been enforced with complex charms and runes, creating a prison more secure than Azkaban. It was charmed to be completely soundproof, preventing any disturbance to the upstairs family, and nobody but Mispy and Tobble, who bought in food, could apparate in and out. Cassiopeia and Peter moved purposefully towards the first 2 cells on the left side, sneering down at the 4 guests, as they used their arms to shield their eyes from the unforgiving light of the torches. They had been kept in dark or dim light since they arrived, with no real concept of time, unaware it had only been 2 weeks since they had been captured and brought here. Their only human contact was with Peter, who made his disdain for them well known, and their food was brought to them by 2 small vicious little creatures. Every day they felt pain, hunger and despair, just like they deserved. Both cells housed a couple each, husband and wife curled together afraid for their lives, and the lives of their children that weren't here with them. Their clothes were torn and dirty, having been stuck here for 2 weeks. Their feet were bloody, bruised and blistered, always cold and shivering. Each for the muggle's waist and a bowl for water, as if they were dogs. The first cell had a man who was extremely large and beefy, with a heavy face with fat cheeks and what appeared to be 3 chins with no neck. It was clear he ate himself past being full, plus the fact he never exercised meant he was as large as 3 grown men. Peter and the elves had taken great pleasure in restricting his food, and after just the first night it had become apparent the man was also going to suffer withdrawal symptoms from whiskey and cocaine. His already thin and receding blonde hair became streaked with white and became lank, greasy and dead quickly from all the sweating while he detoxed. His matching thick mustache is now paired with a scruff just longer than stubble. But his defining feature was his mean, beady little blue eyes. He had an evil stare that had women crossing the street when they saw him, and had his fellow salesmen at Grunnings terrified of him. With him in the tiny cell was his wife, who was the exact opposite of her husband on the outside. She was a tall woman, towering over her port husband, and almost skeletally thin. Unlike her husband, she had a long and dainty neck, almost double of the average woman. It was perfect for snooping on her neighbors. Often she pretended to garden while her son played so she could spy on everyone, hosting a tea afternoon with 4 other women where they would trade all the gossip of Surrey. Her dark hair, which had been blonde when she was young, was usually in perfect waves, not a strand out of place. However, being in a cell changed that. She even had a small bald patch on the left side from tugging on it. The only thing she did share with her husband, the pale blue eyes which held the same malice, now watery and full of fear. The second cell held another man, very different in appearance from the first. He was tall and thin, like the first woman, but instead of being skeletal, he was lean and agile. He was used to going for a run every morning before work, but even the last 2 weeks had affected him. His cheeks now starting to look sunken in, and from the small cell his legs were losing tone, unable to move much. He had a long narrow jaw with a small chin and mouth, and his red frizzy curls were always chopped short to keep them under control. Although without his numerous hair products, even as short as it was starting to look bushy and unkempt. His neck was covered in a messy scruff the same color as his hair. It itched something fierce, but when he dared to ask for water to clean it up, the blasted fat man had dumped an entire bucket of iced water over his face. His dark brown eyes were large and sad behind thin gold wire aviator glasses. His wife was also with him in the cell. She was the smallest of the 4 prisoners, petite and delicate were the words most used when describing her. Barely reaching her husband's shoulders in heels, and a tiny waist which showed no signs of having given birth 3 times. Her dark brown hair was long and straight, once a perfectly tidy fringe and simple cut easy to pull back into braided buns, now a matted mess. Being stuck in the cell without her children had her chewing on the ends frequently, leaving many broken strands. Her eyes were also blue like the other 2 stuck here, but hers were a dark blue, and usually filled with false warmth. Appearing to be the perfect submissive wife and working mother. She loved the role she played. She enjoyed being a dentist as well as a part of the PTA and never missed a single activity her 2 children did. "Hello, Dursleys and Grangers," Cassiopeia greeted them with a dangerous and seductive smirk on her red lips and her blue eyes narrowed. "I do hope you have been comfortable and Peter taking great care of you," she taunted with a dark but enchanting giggle. The men were drawn to her throat as her head fell back, her curly hair sliding off her shoulders. A white light, and the 2 men yelped in pain as Peter hit them with a stinging hex for daring to stare at his master Tom's beloved. She stared at them in disgust as Vernon and John blubbered uselessly, a sneer curling her upper lip. They really couldn't be more different when it came to appearances, but she knew their hearts were the same shade of black, cowards behind their arrogance. They had been very average beta men in life, with mediocre paying jobs but high-standing attitudes. They had held the belief that they were the goal everyone should aim to be, uninvolved in anything exciting, daring or freakish. Or at least, that was the image they portrayed to the world. Their wives were scowling heavily at her. Cassie knew they believed she used magic to enchant their husbands. But the truth was they were just weak-willed men, and both had had numerous affairs since being married. But the 2 women were blinded by the lifestyle they lived, enjoying the lavish gifts from their husbands, sneering down at anyone who didn't have it easy like them, encouraging their children's abusive behavior towards other people solely because they believed them to be perfect and above everyone else. If they had met before this, they would have been the best of friends while gossiping and insulting each other behind their backs. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley with their perfect son Dudley, who they pretended wasn't severely overweight, failing school and the biggest bully in Surrey, he had formed a little gang with. 4 other boys, Piers, Dennis, Gordon and Malcolm, and it was only the grace of their age they hadn't been arrested yet. Having broken windows of neighbors' houses and cars with rocks or destroying anything left out in the front gardens, before running away. They also stole anything they could get their hands on, either keeping it for themselves or selling it for marijuana. Their favorite pastime though was beating up anyone younger or smaller than them. Just last year they had put a 6-year-old boy in the hospital when he refused to hand over his pet dog for them to kill. But because the boy's family had been poor, Vernon was friends with the dirty chief of police Chester Turley, and Pierre's father, Quentin Polkus, was his deputy. They had barely gotten a slap on the wrist. It was only getting worse as they got older. Piers had also been suspended recently for groping female students as he passed them in the hallways. Mr. and Mrs. Granger had gone on to have a second daughter 3 years after abandoning their first, and then a year later a son. They were both as intelligent as the older sister they didn't know about, but unfortunately, they had also inherited their parents' arrogance and entitlement. They were enrolled in the most private and exclusive school in Liverpool, Holy Hope Catholic School. The waitlist was 3 years, students started at 5 and went until 18, only the best of the best were accepted, and every year the 5 lowest performing students lost their spots to take in better transfers. The school would have used any possible savings, as well as forcing them to occasionally dip into a small inheritance from John's parents. But their 2 perfect children had been accepted as scholarship attendees, and only 3 were allowed in each year group. Ophelia and Claudius Granger were bullies just like Dudley, albeit instead of fists, using the intelligence they shared with Hermione, cutting down everyone around them, including their teachers, on the cusp of expulsion for their disrespect. Cassiopeia and Tom had read their minds subtly as they watched them for a few days before they put their plan into action. They knew that the Muggles believed, deep in their dark hearts, that they had been right to throw away Harry and Hermione. That they had been freaks, putting their families in danger so they deserved it. But they had been arrogant, never believing anyone could care enough for them to come and retaliate for it. But the Riddles had. So they came for the Muggles. Late at night, when the men had been enjoying dinner with their wives, Dudley at Piers Polka's house for dinner, Ophelia and Claudius I's home for the weekend. When Tom and Cassiopeia had blasted in their front doors, of course with minor glamours around the 2 houses so the neighbors didn't see or hear or see anything. The 4 Muggles had been hit with a bright white light before they could scream or demand the intruders leave before they called the police. The strange light had made them paralyzed, able to see and hear everything around them, but unable to move or speak. The freaks had moved them easily, as if they were infants. The blonde woman, Cassie the man had called her, grabbed Jean and Petunia roughly. The man had introduced himself as Tom, then he promised they would pay for daring to abuse a magical child. He grabbed Vernon and John. No matter how hard they struggled or fought, their bodies never responded, never moving an inch. For the Dursleys, as they were marched out of their house, they could see a couple from up the road walking their dog. But with the charms in place, the couple walked straight past them, destroying any hope in their hearts. With a nauseating spin, they were being sucked up, unable to breathe, none of them staying conscious long enough to see the manor they landed in front of. The next thing they knew, they were waking up in tiny cells, cold and scared. For the first week, they tried to get answers from the man watching over them, even getting desperate enough to ask the creepy little creatures with big bulbous eyes and floppy ears. At first, they were belligerent, demanding to know where they were, why they were here and who was holding them. The men would scream until they were red or purple in the face, Vernon spitting with every word, shaking the bars and holding them as hard as they could, not that they even budged an inch. The anger slowly turned into desperate begging and pleading, hoping their children weren't here with them. "What do you want, you freaks?" Vernon spat defeatedly. "You have already kidnapped me and Pet, leaving my son alone." "Where is my Dudders?" Petunia whined, as scared as she was, she couldn't cry. All cried out, being so dehydrated her lips had cracked and had a dried smear of blood. "Please, just don't hurt Jeannie or my children," John pleaded, on his knees, hiding Jean behind him. "How dare you beg for them?" Cassie hissed, eyes flashing. "You abused my children," she shrieked before taking a breath to calm herself. "Luckily for you, I am not like you and I don't hurt children. Even if they are little brats and bullies, they are just products of your failures," she finally said. "But they don't matter right now. We are ready for you." Chapter end notes. I am so glad to release this chapter. I must have rewritten this one at least 3 or 4 times, but I am finally happy. I hope everyone had a wonderful holiday break. Whether you celebrated the summer or winter solstice, depending on where you are in the world, or maybe Hanukkah or Christmas. I am sorry if I missed any for the month of December. As always, let me know if you liked something or didn't, if there is something you want to see, or even just need something clarified. I do try to explain everything, but I can ramble and get lost sometimes, haha. See you next time. Chapter 4 Chapter notes. Hey everyone. I am sorry this chapter took so long. Unfortunately, this one was a pain, and it took a while before I even liked it enough to do a second and third draft and then edit. But I am finally satisfied, even if it isn't perfect, haha. I hope you all enjoy it. See the end of the chapter for more notes. The training room in Riddle Manor was an impressive sight for those who were lucky enough to be allowed access. It was the prime location for the training of the Inner Circle Death Eaters, as well as being a large enough space for the Inner Circle to train, test and do initiations with Outer Circle members and new recruits. It was also where many, not-so-friendly practice duels got out of control, usually at the hands of Rabaston Lestrange and Barty Crouch Jr. Although, today the training room was devoid of the usual training setups. The magical dummies that could fight back at various levels were shrunken down and tucked up in the storage closet. The training platform that usually took up one half of the room, which looked very much like a Muggle wrestling ring, was floating firmly above the room, touching the ceiling. Without all of the training equipment spread throughout the room, the first thing to catch anyone's eye was the grandiose window wall opposite the entrance door. The window spanned the entire way, floor to ceiling and side to side, divided into 4 columns with black metal panels. Dressed with delicate white lace drapes, which were charmed to lift whenever someone came inside, allowing the bright sunlight, which poured into the room for most of the day, to illuminate every nook and cranny. Just outside the windows was the most charming sight of the garden, filled with bright colors from both magical and Muggle flowers, and further into the garden. All 4 Black Sisters looked after the garden, helped by the Muggle groundskeeper, Frank Bryce. Away from the house and in the middle of the garden was a Victorian garden gazebo, hedged by perfectly maintained lavender shrubs. The wall on the left of the door was a solid built-in dark brown oak bookcase, stretching up to the ceiling and out to each end. Each shelf's backboard and edging were delicately carved into patterns of wand movements for dark, neutral, and light magic. Of course, this collection wasn't anything in size compared to the Riddle Manor's private library room, which was a maze of bookcases, couches, and an uncountable amount of books of all kinds. No, this was a rather small and modest collection, but was filled with almost every published book on defensive and offensive magics, warding, and runes. Then to the right was a plain wall, painted white, but it was the feature of the entire room. A thin protective glass covered the entire wall, charmed to be unbreakable, as well as dust and smudge-free. Only a select few could open it, even the heirs of Riddle Manor weren't trusted with it yet. The wall was split into 4 sections. At the top of each column was a sizable shield, each carefully painted with a family crest. Black, Gaunt, Riddle, Slytherin. The family bloodlines proudly looked down on them. Under each crest was an impressive and daunting collection of both Muggle and magical weapons, having been handed down each line for generations. There was a second of peace as Tom entered the room, basking in this moment, his children getting their revenge while finally learning a vital part of their education. This room was more than just a training room for him. It was here that he and his family, including the Inner Circle and their families, trained to succeed. It was here they planned how they could better the wizarding world. It was cheesy, Tom knew, but this was where the change happened for them. He was pulled out of his contentment rather abruptly at a very loud and high-pitched sound. "Shut up, Myone!" Harry shrieked, causing Tom to flinch before blinking. Oh no, dear Merlin. His son had inherited the black screech. He had thought they had avoided it. Yes, he had heard his son yell and scream before, but never a full black screech. Oh, they would have to talk about this, but just like any good father would, Tom decided to push it to the side. Cassie was the one who could shriek like that. She could deal with him, it was her family's fault anyway. "Oh, bite me, you banshee!" Hermione snapped back. Tom's eyes went wide. "Oh shit. You never call a black a banshee," to their face. As Harry drew in a breath, cheeks pinking and eyes narrowing in anger, Tom leapt in. "Okay, that is enough," he ordered firmly. "I know this is a stressful situation, and if you aren't ready for it, that's perfectly fine. You know your mother, and I would never think of you differently if you bowed out. But I will not have you two taking it all out on each other." Chorused, heads down. There, Tom, that was good parenting, he thought proudly as he hugged them both. "Now, are you two up to this?" he asked carefully. "We don't have to do your training on them if you aren't feeling up to facing them. But if you also just don't feel ready to learn the unforgivables, we can push it back until next summer." "No," Harry denied quickly and furiously. "I want this. I need this. They need to pay," he swore. Facing the demons is the road to recovery. Hermione nodded in agreement with her brother, curly hair flying everywhere. She had read many books on what to expect when faced with your abuser and how confrontation can be therapeutic. Of course, it would also be a plus to see them in pain, she thought with a smirk. "All right." Tom nodded, giving in easily. He trusted his children to tell him when they couldn't handle something. This would be difficult enough without them thinking he didn't believe in them. He was incredibly proud of them. They had come a long way from the quivering children he had found at Wool's orphanage. I would like to refresh ourselves on some of the theoretical studies we did over the holidays, Tom continued, laughing when Harry collapsed back into a small cream settee with a groan. Do we have to? The petite teenage boy whined. He pushed his curly messy hair out of his eyes as he lay down on the settee, head and knees on the cushions with his knees bent and one arm hanging off the couch, the other resting over his eyes. I would like to, Hermione spoke up, ignoring Harry when he snorted with an, "Of course you would." Excellent. Tom clapped his hands. Now, let's start easy. The unforgivables were created in the Middle Ages by 7 extremely gifted magicals. Oswin Abbott, Asmenia Black, Alger and Agatha Burke, Bertram Greengrass, and Winifred Pruitt. Hermione rattled off quickly before Tom could finish. Why in alphabetical order? Harry muttered, baffled. Well done, Tom grinned, ignoring his son. He was pleased to see they were both already starting to calm down. Hermione was pacing, but it wasn't a stressful pace with her hands tugging on her hair, and muttering about nothing under her breath, but instead, just a soft pace silently waiting for the next question. Harry was watching from where he was still on the settee. Hair in a messy halo around his head, hands absently playing with something in his pocket. Tom cracked his neck before he acquioed his favorite chair, the emerald green leather one that he used for his office and Death Eater meetings. He sat down in it with a soft sigh. It was the most comfortable thing he owned. He shot his children a glare when they hid their faces to laugh at the sight of the chair. They thought it was just as ostentatious as their mother did. He shook his head when they just snickered at him. Sometimes he wished his glare worked on his family. They were a powerful coven of friends. All of them had exceptional gifts of magic, Tom said, moving on. No one ever truly knew just how powerful or talented they were. Together they made their fortune and living by creating many spells of all categories for anyone who had the money and ideas but not the skill. Spell crafting is not something just any magical can do. It is a long and tedious journey. Not only do they have to bend magic to pair the movement, words and intention together, but it can take years of testing and perfecting. Tom took a breath to let his words sink in. The twins nodded their understanding. Spell crafting was notoriously difficult and dangerous. They didn't know many who could spell craft. Their father could, of course. They also knew their uncles Severus and Rodolphus could. Then 2 Outer Circle members, Augustus Rookwood and Gareth Greengrass, could also craft spells, although not as easily as the others. It was a badly kept secret that the Marauders, Sirius Black, Remus Lupin, James Potter and Peter Pettigrew had all dabbled in crafting magic together back in their school years, before the split of their friendships at the end of the war. And then the darker side of spellcrafting, Harry and Hermione's friend, a sister in all but blood, Luna Lovegood, lost her mother Pandora to a spellcraft gone wrong. Luna had been in the room when Pandora's wand had exploded. Her mother had chosen not to protect herself, but her 9-year-old daughter, dying in the process. Because of how many years they spent crafting, and how long it took to create and then perfect, the exact date of each Unforgivable's creation isn't known. Tom picked back up. Now do you have any questions? He asked, pausing again to give them a moment. He had encouraged their questions from the time they came home. Even if it had been covered, or they felt like a stupid question, he told them to ask. It's the only way to keep moving forward in any subject of learning. Hartford, are you listening or just playing with your koosh ball? Tom asked as a green blob in the air caught his eye. What a stupid name for a toy, he muttered, with a shake of his head. He had to suppress his laughter when Harry turned his head to look at his father, only for the ball to smack his face as it came back down. I'm listening, Harry sulked. Hermione had not suppressed her amusement, and let out a belly laugh as tears leaked from her eyes, much to Harry's chagrin. So, what are the 3 unforgivable curses? Tom teased, letting out a laugh when Harry groaned and looked at him, exasperation clear across his face. Are you kidding? Harry sighed with a raised eyebrow. We knew those before we even started learning about them. So tell me then, you must know, Tom taunted playfully, snickering when Harry rolled his eyes, fingers tugging on the strands of his koosh ball. The killing curse, the torture curse, and the imperious curse. Harry drawled without breaking eye contact, finishing with an awkward sitting half-bow from his spot on the couch. Well done, Hartford, Tom praised mockingly, with a teasing smirk on his lips as Harry huffed and rolled his green eyes. "And the incantations?" Tom asked, turning to look at his daughter who had summoned a second settee from near the window to sit in. "Avada Kedavra. Crucio. Imperio," she rattled off automatically, without even pausing to think. "They're lime green, crimson red, and I would say either Arctic or turquoise blue." She added the colors after a moment of thought. "Exactly," Tom nodded. "Impressive. I am curious, do either of you remember what happens if you use the spells in Parseltongue?" he asked, not surprised when Hermione answered immediately. "The power behind the spell expands. The pain caused by a cruciatus will double, and the amount of time before those under the curse go insane halves. The imperious becomes even harder to throw off. Many people can throw off an imperious with time, practice and willpower, but using Parseltongue and binding parcel magic to the imperious would make it so only those accomplished in occlumency would be able to fight it off. Except Avada, obviously," Harry snickered. "You can't truly enhance the killing curse, but it does change color, becoming a sort of garnet red, which can make your opponent mistake it for Expelliarmus. Which obviously can end up being a rather large advantage." "Color me, impressed children," Tom praised, smirking when they groaned at his pun. He paused, turning his head to look towards the doorway when he heard a familiar sound of his wife humming and then a small bang and an "oops" in her chipper voice as the deeper voice belonging to Peter chuckled. Knowing his darling wife, she was most likely levitating the Dursleys and the Grangers and had let one or more hit something, maybe a doorframe or one of the many hallway buffet tables. "I can hear your mother coming with our guests," Tom said with a smile as he turned back to his children, watching as they stood up straight. Determination, letting the anger they felt overtake any feeling of fear or nervousness, pulling strength from each other and their parents. They were ready. Tom smirked at the sight of the four muggles struggling uselessly against the magic binding them, a glowing purple strand of magic coming from Cassie's wand, wrapping around them sort of like a muggle whip. Why his son compared that spell to a whip had been something Tom had had no interest in questioning when he heard it. They also had large black blindfolds over their eyes. You could tell they were magically conjured with the spell, Obscuro, because of the way they shimmered and rippled. As if space itself had fallen to blind the victim. And just as he predicted, Mr. Granger's face was scrunched in pain with a red irritated area that seemed to already be forming into a lump. Cassie met Tom's eyes with a self-satisfied smile on her cherry lips as she winked at him. As she went to work with Peter to arrange the muggles further down into the room, Tom placed a hand on the shoulder of both Harry and Hermione, crouching down on his knees to be at eye level. "We can do this however you two wish to," Tom told them, his red eyes darkening in excitement. This was a big moment for his children. Not only were they finally trying out the darkest of all curses which he had been waiting for years, but they were confronting those who had hurt them, who had seen two toddlers who were different to them, and instead of embracing the two, they abused them. He let his eyes drift up to see the disgusting men and women behind Harry and Hermione. They were simply standing there, the whip-like binding gone. By appearance, it seemed that the muggles were free, but Tom had worked with the Lestrange brothers and Augustus Rookwood, for the 2 weeks they had been in the dungeon, to create a set of runes that would work for what he wanted. The four of them would be able to move their limbs and react to magic used on them, even falling over or jumping. But they wouldn't be able to step towards anyone, including each other, nor could they dodge the spells thrown at them, or even try to escape. Only magic would be able to move them around, no matter how hard they tried. Last night the elves had placed a sleeping potion in their waters, and Augustus had carved the runes into the base of their necks. Runes could be extremely dangerous if done improperly, so Tom was more than happy to let Rookwood, who had a mastery in them, do all the work. He had even been smart enough to allow the cell to be a key of sorts, making it so while they were inside their cells they could move as usual with no restrictions. Tom could feel his fury bubbling in his magic as he looked at them. It had been a test of his temper and patience having the monsters of Harry and Hermione's childhood nightmares in his cells. He had wanted to kill the fuckers who had dared to lay their filthy hands on his loved ones. He wanted to make them scream, break their bones, rip off their skin, and boil them alive from the inside for what they did. But he held back. Harry and Hermione deserved the chance to make them themselves first. Although that hadn't stopped him and Cassie from a few painful hexes and curses the night they brought them home. "What do you mean?" Harry's curious voice grounded Tom. Immediately he lowered his eyes to meet theirs. confused for a moment, before remembering what he had said before he got lost in his thoughts. Your mother and I agreed. You can choose how this goes. We can start with any of the unforgivables you wish and just fly right into it, or your mother and I can do some demonstrations for you of each spell with some coaching points before you try. Harry and Hermione shared a look, Avada green eyes locking onto each other, and the rest of the room faded away. They may not have been able to communicate telepathically, but it was a damn near thing. Much like any other set of magical twins, they were closer to each other than anyone else. Their twin came before anyone, even soulmates. They were even able to know exactly how the other feels or thinks with a simple connection of their eyes. Hermione was very methodical when it came to learning magic. She preferred letting others go first, watching their failures and successes, all the while taking notes. Listening to those who could teach her, absorbed their knowledge, and then compared it to what she knew from her beloved books. Then she would go over the wand movements and the pronunciation, again and again until she felt she had a good hang of it. Only then would she cast the spell. Once she was happily competent with her casting, she would let herself feel the magic, letting her core bond with it, before starting to experiment. Adjusting in any which way she could, her patience and determination meant she had unbelievable control over her spells and the power. She hoped to be a master of at least 5 spells before she was 17 like her father, and maybe even someday create her own. Harry was almost the exact opposite of his twin, preferring to haphazardly throw himself into the deep end. He could feel his magic guiding him, teaching him. All he had to do was listen to it. So instead of watching others, he would be the first to cast, learning from his failures and successes. Focusing on how right or wrong every move he made felt, from how the words felt on his tongue and how the movements flowed from his wrist, to the swiftness or stiffness in his posture, and how his core either soared or resisted the magic and spell as he thought of his intent and what he needed from himself. Despite how different his methods were from Hermione's, he also was incredibly adept at magic. His control and power were just as strong and precise as his twin sister. He had a few spells he knew he wanted to master, but didn't plan on working his way through as many as Hermione wanted to, nor did he have much interest in creating magic. They nodded at the same time, knowing exactly what they wanted to do. You know, as much as I love your bond with each other, Tom mused, it is creepy when you just stare at each other, not blinking or talking for 5 minutes. Did you just call my children creepy, Tom? Cassiopeia asked threateningly, eyeing him with a frown and pointing her wand at him. Absolutely not, he denied quickly, standing up straight and stiff, shaking his head. She narrowed her eyes before turning to her laughing children. So have you decided what you want to do? She asked. I would hope your father at least managed to cover that it was up to you. Of course, I did, my darling, Tom scoffed with a false offense. Do you think so little of me? Yes, she deadpanned, much to the amusement of Harry and Hermione, but she softened it with a wink and grin. Now, even though I told Peter he could stay, he said he didn't want to intrude on this family's revenge moment, so he had made plans and it is just us. What? Tom asked startled, with who? He frowned. After everything that had happened, he still felt protective of the man even years later. It was a miracle Peter wasn't a permanent resident of the Janus Thicky ward, that he hadn't ended up lost inside himself, a shell, like Tom's father and grandparents. They had only been under the Imperius compared to Peter under Imperium Summa, and Tom hadn't been able to save them, locked inside themselves. They only had theories for why Peter hadn't been more affected by the Imperium Summa. But among them was because Dumbledore had not used it as frequently as he should have, underestimating how powerful Peter was. Believing him weak, just because he wasn't as flamboyant as his friends with their magic, despite knowing Peter had become an illegal animagus with them at 15. Also, Dumbledore hadn't realized how much Peter had to fight for. Yes, he hadn't been a smooth talker, being single for most of his life, but he had had a family. He fought and kept his hopes up for James, Sirius and Remus, and Henry. Severus had also proposed that the blood bond the 4 marauders had done at 15 had worked better than they had thought. That his friend's magic helped him survive, and even helped with his recovery after the ordeal. He has a date with Electo Caro, Cassie revealed with relish, giving a little clap of excitement. Good for him, the Dark Lord uttered, his lips curling into a half-smile. He looked almost delighted. Isn't she sleeping with her twin brother? Harry asked, looking green and nauseated. That's what I heard, Hermione nodded, looking just as sick. Tom stared at his children dumbstruck, while Cassie let out a gurgle from beside him. "Where did you hear that?" she finally screeched, gray eyes narrowing. "Uncle Rabaston," Harry answered, immediately throwing his uncle under the broom. "Uncle Barty," Hermione shrugged nonchalantly. "Maybe we should be teaching you two loyalty instead of the unforgivables." Tom snorted, looking at Harry and Hermione, who had no remorse, judging by the widening grins on their faces. "Those two, honestly," Cassie hissed, "maybe they need a reminder about watching what they say around my children." "Don't break them, my love," Tom sighed. "I still have use for them, just a little bit," Cassie promised, waving off his concerns. "But, no," she continued, turning to Harry and Hermione, "she is not in a relationship with Amicus. That is absolutely ridiculous and disgusting. Besides, Amicus is gay and never moved on after Evan died," Tom added helpfully. "Yes, because that's the only thing wrong with this scenario," Cassie sighed in exasperation, adding an eye roll at her husband. "Alecto has been sweet on Peter since they met in the White Wyvern when he was trying to infiltrate us." "Oh, I do love that pub," Tom sighed with a smile. "It has great food and I love the dark atmosphere. It just adds to the fun on Inner Circle night." "Anyway," Cassie interjected with a judging glance at her husband, who appeared to be lost in memories of his nights out with the Inner Circle. She struggled a bit with her emotions with Peter. She was devastated when he showed up half dead and she thought she was going to lose him. Then she was furious and heartbroken when he admitted to being a spy when they had met. Of course, she was too happy with him surviving and recovering to stay mad. "I am just surprised it took this long," Tom commented. "She has been by his side through all his recovery, and it's been, what, 6 years since he showed up at the Malfoy Manor." "Yes, it is long after due," Cassie nodded. "They both deserve to be happy, so no meddling, Tom." "I don't meddle," Tom huffed, ignoring that he had had thoughts of how to help ensure they stay happy. Also ignoring how he had meddled with many of the Inner Circle before. A loud muffled grunt had the Riddles jump and turn around with their wands out. "Oh dear, I forgot we had company," Cassie giggled lightly as they watched Vernon trying to move his body and struggling against the magic. John seemed to be moving his head fruitlessly, perhaps trying to dislodge the magical blindfold. While Petunia and Jean were in a state of shock, they were frozen, afraid to even try and move. Why had they been moved out of their cells? Their captors had promised revenge and pain, but they had no idea what these insane freaks had planned for them. "So, I know we got distracted there," Tom chucked, "but you have decided how you would like to start." "I want to go first," Harry grinned, vibrating in excitement, shaking enough to drop his wand. "Oops," he muttered. "I am happy to watch him and learn from his inevitable mistakes," Hermione chuckled as Harry picked his wand up with a muffled, "Hey," at her jab. "All right, let's just fly right in then," Tom grinned. "Do you know which unforgivable you want to try first?" Cassie asked as she watched proudly. "The Cruciatus," Harry said quickly, before frowning. "No, the Imperious," but yet again he frowned. "Nope, the Cruciatus," he declared with a grin. "You sure?" Tom asked with a grin. Hermione snorted when Harry frowned again to think, tapping his chin with his finger. "Yes, the Cruciatus," he confirmed with a sharp nod. "The torture curse, and the hardest of the 3 to cast. I should have known," Tom grinned. "Now, you know the incantation, Crucio. There is no wand movement, you just point your wand at your victim and focus your magic." Tom moved to stand behind Harry, hands on his shoulders as Harry squared up, his narrowed eyes glaring at Vernon Dursley, who was still trying to escape. The runes were doing their jobs flawlessly. He couldn't move beyond the wriggling and his legs wouldn't let him move in any direction. "Please, please," John Granger started begging. "Don't hurt us." He had stayed quiet while the people he couldn't see talked, hoping they would forget them. But they sounded like they were preparing to go to torture them. He didn't understand many of the words they used, Cruciatus, Imperious, Unforgivables, but he could hear the glee in their voices when they said torture. 2 were young, perhaps just older than his 2 children, the other 2 seemed to be their parents. He knew they were freaks like the blasted girl they had left at the orphanage, and some of the things the blonde woman had said sounded like it was revenge for it. But why she would care still baffled him. Vernon was in a similar state of mind. Angry that these freaks dared to talk so breezily about harming him and his wife. They had only done what they needed to. They had to protect their son. It was obvious they were pissed about how they had treated the freak before abandoning him. He had wondered once or twice about what had happened to the freak, but always brushed it aside. He wasn't worth the thoughts. Petunia even confided in him one night about fearing repercussions for it, but he had told her it was fine, no one was looking for the boy. He didn't know if these people knew him, but from the way the family talked, he was starting to think the parents were freakish serial killers and now they were passing the torch. "Shut up," Harry sneered, "you deserve everything coming to you." "Please," Petunia finally spoke, pleading as she sobbed tearlessly. "I just want to go home. I am sorry for whatever you think we did. I am sorry if you have us mistaken for someone else, and I am sorry that you were angry. But please, my son, my daughters. I just want to go home to him." "Stop that, pet," Vernon thundered, sounding much like his old self. "We do not grovel at the feet of freaks. I was right all along. They're dangerous monsters. They will be sorry for even daring to breathe our air. Chester and Quentin will find us and shoot these kidnapping fuckers on sight." Tom erupted into laughter. "I am sorry, do you honestly think anyone has any inkling of where you are?" He had to stop to take a breath. "This house cannot be found by muggles, nor anyone who wishes my family harm. The wards protecting this manor are far stronger than any pretend magic you have in your stories. Now, Harry," Tom turned to his son, "are you ready?" Harry grinned, his Avada green eyes twinkling as he raised his wand in place of answering. He looked at Vernon and with a quick, finite incantatum, the blindfold slipped off his eyes. The Muggle man blinked furiously as he adjusted to the bright light of the room. He could see Petunia to his left, ramrod straight, blindfold still on. To his right was John, and then his wife next to him. They all appeared to be stuck the same way as he was. Hesitantly he looked up to see the family before him. They were all captivating, the blonde woman and brunette man who had kidnapped them still looking as beautiful as the first time he saw them. Surely it was part of their freakishness, to help lure unsuspecting honest and decent people to teenager. He had heard myths of demons who used their power and alluring looks to suck the life out of humans. Incubus and succubus, he wondered if that was what this family was. The only other freaks he had had the displeasure of meeting, his wife's sister Lily, her husband James and their friends Sirius, Remus and Peter had all been just as bewitching. It was then his eyes focused on the young girl and boy, standing in front of their parents. They were young, maybe around the same age as his son Dudley. Although it made sense the freaks would train their spawn young, if you wanted to be the most dangerous animal in the world, it must take practice and training. Both children had soft chestnut brown hair, the perfect combination of their mother's blonde and father's dark brown. They also both had striking green eyes, glinting dangerously in the sunlight, but the boy seemed to have his mother's soft face, while his sister had their father's sharpness. No matter how hard he racked his brain, he just couldn't place them. The mother mentioned earlier that he had abused her child, which was preposterous. He had never met these freaks, of that he was sure. It was an embarrassingly long time before he noticed the wood in the boy's hand, pointed at him. Fuck. Chapter end notes. I have a Facebook account, Remade. Feel free to join me there and get updates with images related to the FIC. Also, I have been having trouble with spam, fake accounts adding me, so if I have accidentally ignored yours please let me know. Chapter 5 Chapter notes. This is a dark chapter smiley face. I love it and had fun with it once I got my writing groove going. But for those that might not enjoy the darker side and dark magic, and torture you might want to skip this chapter. But for those that will read please enjoy the long-awaited FIC. See the end of the chapter for more notes previously. It was then Vernon's eyes focused on the young girl and boy standing in front of their parents. They were young, maybe around the same age as his son Dudley. Although it made sense, the freaks would train their spawn young. If you wanted to be the most dangerous animal in the world, it must take practice and training. Both children had soft chestnut brown hair, the perfect combination of their mother's blonde and father's dark brown. They also both had striking green eyes, glinting dangerously in the sunlight, but the boy seemed to have his mother's soft face, while his sister had their father's sharpness. No matter how hard he racked his brain, he just couldn't place them. The mother mentioned earlier that he had abused her child, which was preposterous. He had never met these freaks, of that he was sure. It was an embarrassingly long time before he noticed the wood in the boy's hand pointed at him. Fuck. Harry felt his red lips stretch out, giving a rather manic and sadistic grin at the fear in Vernon's eyes. He twirled his wand slowly. Vernon tracked the movement nervously. The black hematite focus stone twinkled in the light. The stone was held in place inside the wand's handle with delicately carved holly leaves. They wrapped around the outside of the stone and halfway down the wand. Ollivander was one of the best for a reason. He had a gifted hand for wand creation. Unable to help himself, Vernon opens his mouth. "Who are you?" he demanded, his infamous anger overtaking the fear. His blue eyes darkened as he took in a bruise on Petunia's face. Cheeks going from a light tan to a dark red, verging on purple. He looked up to make eye contact with the boy in front of him for the first time. The green eyes he had seen before seemed even more dangerous as they locked onto his own blue eyes. He knew those eyes, not just from earlier today. But he knew in his gut that he knew his child. But in his fear and anger, he just couldn't place how or who. The boy stopped his pacing in front of him. His green eyes pinned on Vernon. His lips still pulled in that terrifying grin. The child reminded him of the animated clown in the bat show Dudley loved. The thought of his son had him feeling dread. He didn't say it out loud, but he loved his son from the day the doctor put him in his arms. The blonde woman had said they didn't hurt children. He didn't trust them, but he held onto that hope that she had told the truth, that Dudley was unharmed. Harry twitched at the question. He knew his looks had changed. He looked like his parents' child. The Black and Riddle genes are strong in the twins. He also knew he had been a toddler when they last saw each other. But how had he not figured it out yet? Had the monster from Harry's childhood been so callous to actually forget him? Vernon Dursley had been the monster in the shadows and nightmares for years. He had terrorized him. He had been a baby, an innocent. He had no right. Harry felt himself moving and his arm raising backwards, arm bent as his lips opened. "Crucio!" he shouted as he stabbed his arm forward at Vernon. A bright red light burst from the tip of his wand. It raced towards the walrus of a human. It was in slow motion as Vernon stared in horror, unable to move away. A moment of silence before the light hit its target. Vernon cried out in pain as he was sent flying. He went clear across the room before coming to a stop as he smacked the wall. He let out another cry of fear and pain as he wriggled, trying to free himself of the binds fruitlessly. Watery blue eyes looked over at the freaks, waiting for their next move. Harry stood there for a moment, in complete bafflement. He clutched his wand in his hand and held it to his chest as he bit his lip. What just happened? That's not what happens when his father, uncles or aunt use the curse. Not that he would ever disobey his father and sneak in to watch his meetings. No, he would never. He blinked and tilted his head as he looked towards his father for help. Tom smiled at Harry fondly. His small heir looked adorable in his confusion. For a moment, the image of the small teenager flashed back to the tiny little 4-year-old he had been when Tom found him. How confused he had been when he found out it wasn't just him and Hermione who had magic. But he also remembered a young Regulus having the same result when he had tried the curse for the first time. The black genes were very strong in his son. So much like his mother and uncles Sirius and Regulus. "You need to mean it in order to channel it," Tom spoke before Harry could say anything. Neither Tom nor Harry paid any attention to Vernon's groaning in the background. "For the Cruciatus curse to work, you need to feel it in your blood and core. You need to want to hurt them. Focus on either your anger or desire and let it fill you. Feel your magic humming from the tip of your toes up to your head. It is because of this that the Cruciatus curse is the hardest of the unforgivables when casting. Being an emotional spell, you need to feel it down to your core. The Patronus is the same, having to draw on a happy memory." Cassie agreed, running her hand over Hermione's hair. "With the Cruciatus, there are two principal ways to cast it. The first is feeling anger. This is revenge or a punishment for you. Allowing the anger to flood you," Tom continued, taking over from his wife. "The other is to use joy and happiness. For this, you need to find the joy in hurting people. You allow the joy to float around you. You desire it like a treat, something you don't get often but always look forward to." "So, does the emotion change anything about the spell?" Hermione asked curiously as Harry seemed to ponder on his father's words. "Yes, it does," Tom nodded, smiling. Proud of his daughter's never-ending need for knowledge. So much like himself. "Your mother's Cruciatus, for example, is powerful and ice-cold. Like frostbite. Your Aunt Bellatrix and Uncle Rodolphus are the same. Because they don't need anger to cast the spell. They feel the enjoyment from inflicting the pain. Tom shot a playfully judging look at his wife. Rare to cast a cold cruciatus, he continued, but according to records, the majority who do cast cold are a black by blood. Even though it is rare to cast cold, I am only aware of 2 black members who don't, in fact, cast a cold crucio. Tom paused briefly to breathe and make sure Harry was still listening. Sirius and Regulus both cast hot. Although Sirius, unlike Regulus has only used the curse a few times. During the war when he got desperate. Sirius is also the only one known to us to use the curse to save a life. Cassie interrupted. James Potter had gotten hurt in the holidays before their 7th year. I don't know the events, but we all heard the rumors that his heart had been weak and irregular. They feared it would stop. Remus had read about a Muggle device that uses electric shocks to stop a heart, forcing it to restart itself. In a panic, Sirius used the cruciatus on him, and it worked. James woke up with his heart working normally again. Wow, Harry breathed. He was eager to learn more and more about his mother's cousin, and his original godfather, who had cared for him when James and Lily didn't. But his father and mother were still bonding with the man, trying to figure out if they trusted him after being one of Dumbledore's lapdogs and being so against his family and dark magic for so long. So what's the other crucio? Hermione asked. Is it hot? Tom grinned. Yes, exactly. Your father's, Cassie nodded, is a hot curse. It feels more like hot knives or lava invading your veins. This is because his anger and the need to punish those who failed or wronged him fuels it. Your uncles, Rabaston and Barty's, crucios, are the same. They pull that anger to the top, allowing it to bubble. Most people can't cast both types of crucios. Tom finished. Those who can usually go through something extremely traumatic in order to switch. He grabbed Cassie's hand when she flinched. Bella and Rod have only cast a hot cruciatus once. Cassie whispered, her gray eyes staring out, but unseeing. 1981. They were so broken and angry. Desperate for the Longbottoms too. Feel every inch of the pain and heartbreak that they were feeling. The pain they had caused our family. Tom's eyes were dark at the reminder. It was only a matter of time before they could make sure that Alistair Moody and Lily Potter finally suffered the same fate. Their actions will not go unpunished. Yes. Well. Cassie shook her head and wiped away her tears. Let us not dwell on such things today. She with finality and a tight smile. Of course, Tom agreed, his hand on her back. He turned back to Harry. Do you think you are ready to try again? He asked, looking at his son. Harry nodded, looking at Vernon. The Muggle was back to the spot next to his wife. He was crying and shaking from the spell. It hadn't worked fully, but it still caused small electric shocks which Vernon had thought were bad enough, but knew it was about to get worse judging by the way the freaks were talking. Yeah, I'm ready. Harry nodded as he took in Vernon's state of panic. You may have forgotten who I am. Vernon Dursley. Harry started. His magic crackled around him, the tingles spreading from his fingers and toes to the rest of his body. But I never forgot you. Vernon appeared to be piecing together what was happening, albeit slowly. Which might have been because of his fear and pain, or he just wasn't that smart. I remember how you would lock me in the cupboard under the stairs. I remember you stuffing your faces as I starved in the dark. The pain from the whippings with your belts stayed with me. The way you would scream and slap me around. Vernon's mouth dropped. It was the freak himself. How had he survived? He had dropped the child without care at a Catholic orphanage. How had the freak found them? They had moved houses and wiped their hands off of the whole thing. Petunia had gasped next to Vernon. Hermione grinned, waving her wand and removing Petunia's blindfold. The first thing she saw after adjusting was Harry with his wand pointed at Vernon. He looked nothing like Lily or James. She noted. Neither did he look like her family. Potter. Vernon spat. It's Riddle now actually, Harry corrected him. Green eyes narrowed as his magic and rage built up slowly. He moved into a stable casting position. Legs apart with his dominant right leg slightly further forward than his left. His right arm was out straight, whereas his left was out to the side for balance. Bent at the elbow, looking a bit like a wing. He closed his eyes and focused on the anger deep in his core. It was already there, bubbling just below his gut. He thought back on the little things he remembered. How the Potters neglected him after Dumbledore declared to the wizarding world that Henry was the boy who lived. How they then left him on the doorstep of the Dursleys. He thought about how Dumbledore manipulated everyone, including Harry's father Tom. He even thought about how there was most likely a potion controlling James. How Bellatrix lost her heart in one night because of the orders Dumbledore gave Lily, Moody, Frank and Alice. Harry opened his eyes, the eyes glowing with his power. The killing curse color dancing and shimmering. He smirked at Vernon. Crucio! He shouted, the bright red light bursting from his wand. But this time, instead of blasting Vernon into a wall, it encased him. Vernon crumpled to the floor, mouth open as he screamed. Screamed harder than he had ever screamed before. The pain was white-hot, igniting all his nerves. He could actually feel the anger that was directed at him. Vernon's throat felt like the skin was peeling off from the scream that was never ending. He threw his head back as he felt his massive body bending and contorting in ways he didn't know was possible. His body was writhing across the floor as he tried to escape the pain. Unable to tell which was up or down, left or right. Harry was grinning as the power washed over him. His magic came alive with the casting dark magic. His core accepted it immediately. He could feel his magic dancing around him. The light electric tingles moved along his skin. Goosebumps covered his body as he held the curse. He could faintly hear Vernon screaming. The sound was a kind of muted and muffled noise, as if Vernon was underwater. He could also hear Petunia screaming for her husband. Tears streamed down her cheeks. Out of the corner of his eye, he could see John and Jean hunched down as much as the runes let them. Harry felt his giggles as they made their way up from his stomach, escaping out his mouth. His body flooded with ecstasy. As he tilted his head back slightly, his bright eyes glazing over as the red glow from the curse seeped into his sight. Tom watched with pride as his son cast the unforgivable successfully on his second try. It did not surprise him in the slightest when, after 2 or 3 seconds, Harry started cackling uncontrollably. Laughing was the most common reaction when someone used such powerful dark magic, and the cackling was purely from the black side. He grinned as his son held the curse, even though his laughing was making it hard to breathe. Although when his son's bright green eyes lit up, and the Avada green glowed, he had to admit that had taken him aback. He shared a glance with his wife and he knew it startled her, too. Hermione was standing close, methodically studying Vernon's reaction and her brother's magic. Finally, before the Muggle went insane, Tom stepped in, pushing Harry's wand up to the roof, breaking the connection of the spell. Vernon went limp immediately, panting and crying. Tom scrunched up his nose and waved his hand, removing the mess the Muggle had made in his pants. Disgusting. With another wand, he re-silenced Vernon and his wife, who was screeching at him, telling him to do something. "How are you feeling?" Tom asked Harry as he turned around to look at him, grinning at these. Cassie was running some diagnostic spells over their son now the giggling had stopped. Just making sure his body hadn't fought against the dark magic. But it appeared his core had accepted it just as easily as Tom's core had back when he was young. Cassie was nodding happily at the results, shaking her head with a giggle when her son swayed into his sister, still very blissed out. "Good," Harry slurred with a wonky smile, his eyelids sitting heavily half open. Hermione kept him steady with a hand on his back. Cassie guided Harry to the small couch they had conjured earlier, ordering him to sit and relax. "You can have another try later, once this has passed. We don't want you to overwhelm your core. You haven't subjected your core to such strong dark magic before." Harry nodded happily as he lay down, his head in Hermione's lap. "Does it always feel like this?" he asked, looking up at his father. He couldn't believe it did, otherwise how would anyone fight or duel with dark magic? "No," Tom confirmed with a smile and a shake of his head. He patted Harry lightly on his shoulder as he pulled his chair over next to the couch and sat down. "The release of pressure around your core will always be there, but never this intense again. Every core is neutral, neither light nor dark. Because of this, it can accept and create both light and dark magic. But while the core is neutral, everyone has a magical leaning. Some people find either light or dark magic extremely easy, but the other will be quite draining and difficult." "But what does that have to do with feeling like this?" Harry asked, baffled. His tongue was still heavy and mind was foggy. But the tingles were slowing down and he no longer felt the loss of breath. "I am getting there," Tom chuckled at his son's impatience. When your core is first introduced to powerful magic, dark or light, it has to expand and adjust. What it does, because it is neutral, it can take in the magic and absorb it. When it is being absorbed, the core has to adjust itself to accept it. When it expands and adjusts, it releases the excess through basic body functions, such as laughing or crying. But as you use the magic more and more, the core becomes bigger, but also recognizes the magic easier, therefore, making it easier to absorb and adjust. So the more you use it, the less side effects there will be. Of course, the core and magic still have so much we don't understand, Cassie added, smiling. The core is one of the many things the unspeakables at the ministry study, although much of the work they do is classified. When they get all the answers they are looking for, and it is safe to do so, they release papers and books on their work. I believe we have some copies in our library. Tom nodded as Hermione opened her mouth. Alto will help you find them whenever you wish. He smiled. Alto was the head librarian of the Black, Riddle and Slytherin Manor Library. He was a good house elf and adored the books as much as Tom and Hermione did. My own? Harry drawled as he looked up at his sister. His black pupils were still wide and the thin rim of green iris still glowing, although definitely dimmer than before. That was great. He grinned, smiling wider when she laughed. You should try it, he nodded seriously. I feel good. Hermione laughed freely as all of her nervousness faded. She could see her mother tending to Vernon and Petunia, moving them off to the right side of the room. Still bound and Vernon's blindfold back on nice and tight. So darling, Cassie called over her shoulder to her daughter as she moved John and Jean into the middle. Now the two Grangers were standing where Vernon had been for Harry just moments ago. Do you know which curse you would like to try first? Cassie asked with a smile. It was bittersweet. She was so happy this day was here. They were learning the magic of their families and getting revenge on those who had harmed them. But she also felt a slight sorrow. Her darling children were already 13 years old. Where had the time gone? The imperious, Hermione smirked as her green eyes raked over the Grangers. Her eyes alight with malicious joy. She had put a lot of thought into how today would go. What spells she would use, and why. Perhaps in another world where the Grangers had loved her, she would feel perhaps horror with herself because of how excited she was to torture two muggles. But they deserved this, and everything else coming to them. A good choice, Tom nodded in approval. It is an odd spell when compared to its two counterparts. Unlike the Cruciatus and the Killing Curse, your emotions and desire will not power the Imperious Curse. Hermione nodded, listening intently as Tom continued to explain. You don't need to want to see the victim suffer, but it needs you to focus and control your mind. It is a very deliberate spell. As you cast the curse, you will need to lower your occlumency walls. He smiled ruefully at the sudden panic on Hermione and Harry's faces. But we built the occlumency walls to keep people out. Harry spluttered as he sat up. He was finally feeling back to himself, although still a little weak in his muscles and floaty in his head. You don't need to drop them completely, Tom promised, knowing that while for most magicals, the idea of lowering their shields would be uncomfortable at worst. But for his twins, it was so much more. Occlumency walls helped them control their powerful magic. With how strong their cores were, even the slightest change in emotions can lead their magic to lash out in bursts. He dreaded to think how much damage they could have done to the manor without the occlumency walls before they got their focus stones. What will happen is, when you cast the Imperious, Tom continued, you will feel a push against your walls as your magic tries to bond with your victim's mind. You are taking total control of them. You are becoming their brain, sending orders to their body. If you don't lower your shields enough for the bond to form, then you could do serious damage to their brains and even your own. Many have screwed up and become permanent patients of St. Mungo's in the Janus Thicky ward because of a poor connection. We could lose our minds casting it? Harry asked as he sat up and tilted his head to the left. He sounded a little too interested and amused for Tom's liking. That is very unlikely, Cassie laughed delicately, her son reminding her fondly of a younger Bellatrix. For a caster to do serious damage to themselves and the victims, there has to be repeated use of an incorrect bond. Or something breaking the connection so suddenly and forced a snap strong enough that there is a magical burst. But that is rare. Okay. Hermione nodded, feeling more comfortable, whereas Harry actually looked slightly disappointed. What does the Imperious feel like? You said the Cruciatus had two different feelings. For them or for you? Cassie chuckled. As the caster, Tom spoke at the same time as his wife, but she waved him on to continue. It feels like waves of water pressing against your mind, lapping to get in. Then, when you find the connection and bind with it, it becomes a whisper behind your ears. You can feel them the entire time you have them under the curse, but it is very faint. Many people can continue their day-to-day lives without bothering them. For a first-time caster, it can be very disorientating though, Tom explained. If you perform properly the curse, Cassie continued again, and the bond between your core and the victim holds correctly, then they will follow your orders while appearing to be normal to the ones in their lives, going on as if nothing is wrong. The weaker the connection, the more obvious it is to those who know the victim best, and it will not take long for them to realize something is wrong. Hermione nodded in understanding, making notes in her mind. She wished she had Broither, and debated summoning it. She kept track of every new spell she learnt, a page to every spell. The incantations, movement, description of said spell, and then any notes of things she thought were important to remember. But Harry had said because they were learning to cast and finally doing the practical work, she wouldn't need it. Why did I listen to him? She thought with an eye roll. What about as the victim? Harry asked curiously with a soft lift in his lips. I will let your mother take that one, Tom said stiffly. Although he had never been under the control of the Imperius, he had been under the Imperium Summa. The memories of what Dumbledore made him do, they made it hard to talk about it. This was also why he also wasn't usually one to cast the Imperius, only doing so when he absolutely needed to. But when he had a choice, he would have Severus and Barty perform the curse. They were both very adept at the curse and easily the best Tom knew. On the other wand, he had banned Rabaston from using the Imperius for missions. The very few times the younger wizard had successfully cast it, he then made the victim do the stupidest things he could think of, instead of the actual job he was supposed to make them do. All the times he failed, which was most of the time, the victims became useless to them with their minds snapping. If a magical mind had snapped, it meant it had disconnected from their core. When this happened, it didn't matter how well the Imperius was cast. They would be robotic and slow to follow the orders. There was even a case or two of the Imperius not working at all on them after the snap. The reason the Imperius is such a dangerous spell, despite being the only unforgivable you can fight off, is because of the wonderful feeling it produces. As the victim of this curse, you will feel the most wonderful lightness, like floating. The curse removes every worry or sadness you have ever thought or felt, leaving nothing but a warm and vague feeling of happiness. Totally unaware of your actions while under it, Cassie explained. Although once you are free, released from the curse's grip, you will remember everything like a nightmare, and those memories will never fade unless wiped by the obliviate. Tom added quickly. Wow, Harry breathed. Now he definitely wanted to try being on both sides of the curse. That powerful sense of peace, that is why most people are so susceptible to it. When you feel that kind of true contentment, you do not want to fight it off. But it is possible. Tom said, unlike when under the Imperium Summa, he thought bitterly, but he shook it off and continued. Barty has the quickest reaction to throw it off I have ever seen. He doesn't even stop, it just rolls off him like water on a hydrophobic surface. Really? Harry asked, eyes wide as he shared an impressed look at Hermione. Yes, every member of the inner circle, including their Uncle Barty, was extremely powerful. But the twins didn't know anyone could just have the Imperius roll off them. Oh yes, Cassie nodded. I remember the first time Barty went under the curse. She shook her head. It seemed like so long ago now. So much had happened since they were children. Barty, Regulus and Rabaston were the youngest to be marked, only 16. Cassie paused, sending her husband a playfully disappointed look and tutted. I was insane. Technically you can't hold that against me, he defended quickly with a smirk. Cassie laughed, shaking her head before turning back to Harry and Hermione. No one outside of the inner circle besides me and Marigold even knew that they had received the dark mark. It was top secret. But Dumbledore was suspicious. He already suspected that Tom was not only recruiting in Hogwarts, but that Slytherins were training their children to be marked as young as possible. So he kept a close eye on us in particular. But one weekend, we were down in Hogsmeade just having a good time. And out of nowhere, Barty stopped talking. He went rigid and his eyes glazed over. Harry had his mouth open in horror, his bright green eyes just blinking in shock. Someone cursed him in Hogsmeade? Oh yes. Cassie nodded. It only lasted a few seconds before Barty was shaking and back to himself. He took off running with his hot on his heels. We huddled down in the Three Broomsticks, which thankfully is always full of people. I can't believe someone would curse, not only a student so close to Hogwarts in Hogsmeade, but wasn't this while Bartemius Crouch Sr. was at the height of his career in the Ministry? Hermione asked, baffled. Crouch Sr. had been a powerful man before the Aurors acting on the word from the Order of the Phoenix arrested his son for being a marked Death Eater. He was charged and sentenced to Azkaban with Bellatrix, Rodolphus and Rabaston Lestrange for taking part in the torturing of Frank and Alice Longbottom into insanity. Oh yes, Cassie nodded gravely, it was a tremendous scandal. We all suspected Dumbledore. He had called Barty up to his office earlier that week, and even more Slytherins throughout the entire year. He was calling up anyone he felt he would have an easier time turning. No, Harry gaped in shock. He had done that in Harry and Hermione's first year. Wow, the man had not changed tactics. He was not subtle. Cassie rolled her beautiful gray eyes, smiling when her children laughed. So why did he try to convince Uncle Barty? Hermione asked. The uncle she knew was hard-headed and very dark-oriented. Not someone she would class as easy to turn. Barty was a different person back then, Cassie explained, thinking back. It isn't my story to tell, so I won't go into details. But his home life left a lot to be desired. He came to Hogwarts with no confidence but seeking power. His father Bartemius is a horrid man, but he is a neutral with light leanings. Dumbledore believed Barty had only gone to Slytherin because he had his father's ambition to go far in the Ministry. So, how did he fight it? Harry asked. From his mother's tone, he had strong suspicions on just how horrible Crouch was to one of his favorite uncles and had no intention of prying further. One thing he hated was talking about the Dursleys and Potters. He also hated the thought of others talking about it behind his back. I asked him just that question once we returned to the safety of the dormitory, Cassie smiled. I believe his exact words when I asked were, I felt warm and happy, and I thought nope that's not right. He said he just ran from the feeling, putting up his occlumency walls as he went. Cassie laughed. Dark humor had always been a coping mechanism for Barty, so it wasn't a surprise when he took the chance to make a quip even right after being cursed. Do you need to know anything else? Tom asked, looking at Hermione, who was looking thoughtful as she prepared herself. No wand movement, right? She confirmed, standing up from the couch. Smiling when her father shook his head, then no more questions, she turned to face the Grangers. She waved her wand and with a quick, finite incantatum, the conjured blindfolds fell off of both John and Jean Granger, floating delicately to the floor at their feet. Both of the muggles blinked furiously, trying to adjust to the bright light in the new room. The dungeons they had been kept in were so dark they could barely see the shadows of each other. The only time they could see more than that was when their captors visited them and the torches lit up the dungeon in red and orange. John. Jean cried out with relief as her eyes finally adjusted and she caught sight of her husband beside her. She struggled fruitlessly, trying to get to her husband. John, however, wasn't even looking towards her. Instead, he was staring at the small family in front of him, a frown on his lips and forehead furrowed in frustration and anger. He could hear Vernon's still whim had done to the large man must have been agonizing, judging by the earlier screams and the fact the man was still in pain. There was, of course, a chance, however slim, that Vernon just had a low pain threshold. But John didn't think that was the case unfortunately for himself. John wasn't overly fond of the overweight jackass, but they had commiserated together over having had freaks in their houses and families. Although Vernon had seemed happy that he, unlike Petunia, John and Jean had not been blood related to the freak in his family. The two couples had also spoken about the fear they held for their children. Dudley Dursley aged 13, Ophelia Granger aged 10 and Claudius Granger aged 9. They had no way of knowing if their 3 children were safe, and didn't believe the blonde freak when she said they didn't harm children. John remained stoic, ignoring his wife's screaming beside him. He wouldn't show these monsters his fear. He frowned when the older two, the blonde woman and brunette man who had kidnapped them, stepped back, allowing the teenage girl to take the lead. John felt his gut sink when he realized who was standing before him. His firstborn. The freak they left at the orphanage. He had recognized the name Potter when Vernon had shouted it earlier. Both Vernon and Petunia had mentioned the spawn who Petunia's sister had left on their doorstep, claiming it wasn't a demon like them. So it was clear to John that the boy was the child who had wound up to be a demon like his parents. He had before now thought that he and Jean had done it. That they had kept themselves, as well as their future children, Ophelia and Claudius, safe. But just like the Potter demon, here it was, the female spawn that he himself had left behind in order to protect his pregnant wife and himself. She had thick and curly chestnut brown hair, which was thick and curly instead of the light brown frizzy hair he remembered. But the eyes were the biggest change. Bright green instead of chocolate brown. Filled with fire and anger instead of fear and panic. But John was positive, it had found them. "I see that you have figured out who I am, Johnny," Hermione smirked, twirling her wand in her hand. Thankful that Jean had finally stopped her screaming when John hadn't acknowledged her, she was looking frantically from her husband to the child standing in front of them. "What did you do?" she screamed at her husband. Had he spawned this devil's offspring in an affair? Did he sleep with this child? Why were they here? Unlike her husband, she had not put the pieces together. But that wasn't surprising. Not only had she thoroughly wiped her memories of their first child, determined to forget and move on, but she had also dropped out of school young, believing her only purpose, and her only desire, was to marry well and have a wonderful family to raise in the church like her mother before her. "Don't put this on me," John finally snapped. "You were the one who grew the demon freak for 9 months and then gave birth to it." "Crucio!" Harry screeched as he leapt to his feet, stumbling as he cast the spell quickly. John fell to the ground screaming as blue-flamed fire burnt his nerves. Harry released him after 5 seconds, creeping forward to stand next to Hermione. "Don't you ever call my sister a freak, demon or an it," he snarled, green eyes glowing as his magic swirled around him. "Or I will take your tongue out." "Harry," Hermione whispered with a soft smile, "thank you, but I can fight my own battles." "I know you can," he grinned wickedly. "If either of us were strong enough, it would be you. But it doesn't mean I won't jump in to help you as your brother." "When did our children get sweet?" Tom hissed in Cassie's ear. "Usually they're feral, going at each other." Cassie laughed delicately. "They may get feral, I will admit," she conceded with a smirk, much like Bella, Sirius and Regulus used to. "But you know their bond is strong, not only as twins but as friends and outcasts together. We may never understand the bond they have. But we know they will always be there to help each other." "How did I get so lucky?" Tom asked, kissing his wife on the cheek before turning back to his 2 children. "What is happening?" Jean sobbed, looking at Hermione. "Who are you? Where are my 2 children?" These were the wrong words to say. Hermione's beautiful face contorted harshly into a dark scowl entirely reminiscent of a young Tom Riddle. Harry went to raise his wand again, but the dizziness of casting 2 crucios for the first time, so close together, had him stumble. Tom was fast in his reaction to steady his son, hands on his shoulders. He pulled Harry backwards, giving his daughter a fond smile and a nod of encouragement. "We are right here," he whispered. She shook her head before pulling her curls into a messy ponytail. "Oh, only 2 children?" Hermione asked, glaring at Jean menacingly. "What about your first child? What about your firstborn daughter?" Jean looked disgusted at the very mention. "The little girl you abused for something she couldn't control. You hurt her repeatedly, before then abandoning her in the middle of the night at the letterbox of an orphanage, uncaring if she even lived. She was a freak," Jean screamed, fighting the magical restraints again. "A danger to the normal, perfect baby growing inside me. She would have tainted Ophelia." "Well, your stupidity aside, now you will pay for what you did," Hermione promised darkly, voice going quiet as she approached Jean, her wand out in front of her. "Your genetics made me. You are the reason I was born with magic. The only way that is possible is if one of you has a magical ancestor. So if you want to blame anyone for the magic choosing me, it would be you." Hermione grinned as Jean shuddered in fear as she realized, finally, who was in front of her. "Of course, I take a lot of pleasure in informing you that because one of you passed it down, both Ophelia and Claudius could be magical as well." Hermione winked at Jean as she shook her head in denial. "No," she stuttered, they showed no signs and aren't unholy like you." "Ah yes," Hermione nodded solemnly, "that is because I am powerful, as is my twin brother." Hermione nodded at Harry, smirking when Harry wiggled his fingers in a mocking hello. My magic needed to exercise, if you will, like a muscle. Hermione lectured. But there are many cases where those born to muggles, non-magic folk, have no accidental magic. They don't know they have magic until their 11th birthday when someone from the school comes to them. Ophelia is 11 in October, yes? How do you know that? Jean choked out. How do you know their names? We watched you, Tom smirked, for weeks before we made our move. Had to be careful. Hermione cackled before spinning to face John. As she walked towards him, his eyes darted towards the menacing shadow of her new family behind her. Just standing there proudly as the monster who was once his daughter stalked him. But I guess there is something I should thank you for, Hermione said sweetly, startling John and Jean. She looked back at Harry standing with her parents. If you hadn't left me at Wool's orphanage, I would never have found my family. My genuine family. My parents, who weren't afraid of my gifts, but encouraged them. Taught us to harness it, to use it against those who would harm us. Of course, the irony of all this is simply that you were so sure that I was a freak, a demon, a monster, a danger to you. That you, in fact, created me that way. If you had loved me as my true parents do, I would have loved you in return and never dreamed of harming you. But because of you, how you abused me with the beatings and the neglect, and then finally, abandoning me. Now? Hurting you is all I want to do. Jean started sobbing, pleading out for her life, whispering Ophelia's, begging for mercy. John had stayed silent, but his stoic mask was slipping in fear. He really never could pull off the tough, stoic facade well. Like a child playing dress-up in his father's suit. You didn't stop when I cried. Hermione finally snapped, shouting in anger, you hurt me every day ignoring my pleas. Now it is my turn. She took a deep breath to calm down. She smiled at the two terrified Grangers. It was the same deadly but serene smile her father gave when he was furious, his eyes and teeth promising pain despite the pleasant expression. Now, she said sweetly, do you recognize this? Hermione slipped a large kitchen knife out of her dress pocket slowly. The metal blade glinting in the sunlight, and the red handle slightly faded with a large nick in the base. Duh. That's mine, Jean muttered, confused, blinking at the knife from her favorite set. It had been an anniversary gift from her husband 4 years ago. It had been an expensive set, and she took extreme care of all the knives. But unfortunately the one in Hermione's hand, the chef's knife, the handle had chipped when their dishwasher broke mid-cycle. Yes, it is. Well done. Harry cheered condescendingly. You aren't completely thick then. Hermione let out a chuckle as their parents hushed her brother, saying, it's her turn. You've had yours. But she enjoyed his comments interrupting now and then, reminding her she wasn't alone. Now, Hermione continued, one thing I remember was how panicked you would get saying how my magic would ruin everything for you. Your perfect image of the perfect family. You cared way too much about your reputation at the church and in the county. I remember you screaming about your precious church, and how witchcraft was the work of the devil, and how you couldn't bear the shame if anyone found out you produced the devil's spawn. So, before you both die, she teased, ignoring John's hitched breath and how Jean resumed her sobbing, I will destroy your reputation. I will burn down that image you loved so dearly. She raised her wand. The wood was a soft gray purple, and the newly added purple and green fluorite stone glowed as her magic warmed the wand. Ollivander had carved the fluorite into the handle like Harry's hematite, but Hermione's had vine wood threads wrapped around the stone. She pointed it at John and grinned menacingly, Imperio. Hermione's velvet voice echoed as she chanted the incantation. A white glow, which left her wand swiftly, followed her voice across the room. The result was instantaneous. John's body relaxed and all his fight disappeared, sagging as every emotion left him and his brown eyes glazed over in fabricated peace. Jean cried out in anguish at the change in her husband, full of horror. She didn't know what Hermione had done, but knew it was bad. Hermione immediately felt the waves lapping at her core and the walls, just like her father had explained. With a deep and quick breath, she lowered her expertly built walls. She had been half expecting a tsunami to barge in, breaking her walls. But it was, instead, a delicate trickle. Drops of control soaking her core. Then she felt it, the connection, a thin thread waiting for her to wrap her magic around it. And just like that, the Imperius was in place. It was over within seconds. John Granger was under her total control. John! Jean screamed in fear, crying hard when her husband didn't respond. "John, please," she begged fruitlessly. Her struggle against the magic binding resumed and intensified when he didn't respond to her cries and pleas. "He can't help you," Hermione taunted with a laugh. This was amazing. She could feel her magic singing under her skin, and every sense enhanced. She could see more shades of colors, feel every slight movement of the surrounding air, hear every breath as if they were her own. Taking a moment, she paused and focused on the control she could feel. John's mind was blank with the power of the Imperious. He wasn't able to fight it at all. It was almost like having a puppet, but she could feel the strings attached to the puppet of John in her mind and core. Each one was ready to tug at her whim. "He can't hear you, or see you," Hermione continued joyfully. "He has no control, as if he doesn't exist. Just a spare appendage of me, obeying my every desire." Hermione paused in suspense, leaning over to look Jean in the eyes. "Would you like a demonstration?" she asked lightly. Tom and Cassie watched in awe as John then curtsied and spoke, "As you commanded." The way he spoke normally, with no hesitation, was astounding. Tom had never seen the Imperious Curse used so smoothly on the first try. The skill and power his daughter was displaying had him speechless. His wife let out a choked gurgle next to him, apparently in the same mind of shock. For many first-time casters, the victim would appear very wooden, walking stiffly and only following direct orders without trying to be human. But John had curtsied flawlessly. He was looking around the room and even blinking. Tom and Cassie felt a strong warmth of pride flood them. "You really are the devil's child," Jean sobbed as she watched her husband walk out of the small square of magic that was keeping her trapped in. He had been stuck in place before too, but now he was moving to stand next to Hermione. "I knew you were a monster. I should have drowned you in holy water the day I found out what you were." Cassie let out a wordless shriek at Jean's words and leapt to attack the bitch who hurt her daughter. But Tom held her back. He wished to kill the muggle as well, but this was Hermione's time. Hermione was quiet, letting the woman rant, watching until she finally quietened, dark blue eyes wide with anger and fear. "Johnny," Hermione hummed as she stuck the hand holding the knife out towards John. "Take it," she ordered him, smirking at Jean. John took the knife without a pause, clenching it in his fist. "Stab her," Hermione instructed with an arched eyebrow and her smirk twitching in amusement. Jean screamed as John nodded and walked towards her with the knife. "But make sure don't nick arteries or vital organs. I want to make this last and see her suffer." "No. John would never," Jean screeched, only to sob when John kept walking, his eyes just looking through her. "The wonders of magic," Hermione laughed, "he doesn't have a choice." "John," Jean wailed, but just like before, her begging fell on deaf ears. Her husband was now in front of her. His left hand was on her shoulder, while the right held the knife next to her belly button. She knew she couldn't move, but the fear that filled her was too strong and she tried to move away from the knife. Suddenly, John moved, stabbing the knife forward, burying it into her stomach. She screamed in agony as the knife tore into her. The piercing pain as the hilt smacked her skin was the worst she had ever felt. And she had given birth 3 times. A burning spread throughout her body and she screamed louder than she thought she could when her husband pulled the knife out, lifted it up to her 3rd rib and stabbed her again. "That burning you feel?" Hermione spoke again. "It is a special potion I made with my uncle Severus. We wanted to create a liquid fire, one that would move through your bloodstream, burning you alive from the inside. We managed it as you can feel. I dipped the knife in it earlier today." Harry laughed from behind Hermione, enjoying the show his sister was putting on. "Of course, this won't kill you yet. We were careful to make sure that it would be a slow burn so you can really feel it," Hermione taunted as Jean gasped and gurgled, unable to draw in enough breath to continue to scream. Helpless, as her dear husband just kept stabbing her. Her blood was everywhere. Splatter covered John's face and pooled at his feet. Jean could feel her blood filling her mouth before dribbling out down her neck. The only things keeping her upright were the magical binds and John's grip on her shoulder. She looked up into his brown eyes, hoping for a glimpse of her husband, but he wasn't there. Just the devil's puppet now. She began crying earnestly as it finally hit her. They weren't getting out of here alive. She would die at the hands of her own husband, and no doubt would he die here after her. They would never see their 2 beautiful children again, never seeing them grow up and have families of their own as they showed the world just how great they were. She would never grow old with John and enjoy retirement with their grandkids. Hermione smirked as John pulled the knife out of Jean for the 13th time. "Stop," she ordered before he could stab her again. 13 stabs, it seemed an appropriate number. With a chuckle, she closed her eyes and went back into her walls and core. Slowly, she unwound her magic from around the strings of control. With that, the connection broke and John was free, no longer under the curse. Before opening her eyes, Hermione took a quick second to replace her occlumency walls. She opened her Avada eyes just as John fell to the ground on his knees, taking Jean with him. For him, it was like that second when you wake up from a horrible deep sleep nightmare. Heart racing and the fear still prominent, he looked around, blinking his eyes furiously. Then he saw Jean covered in blood and he realized the nightmare was real. He had stabbed his wife repeatedly. He screamed in anguish, dropping the knife and scrambling his hands as he tried to stop the bleeding. "Jeannie!" But there was nothing he could do. There were too many wounds, and they were too deep. He watched as she let out a shuddering breath, life leaving her eyes. She was dead in his arms, his name on her blood-stained lips. "No, no, no," he sobbed, his hands leaving blood smears over his face as he tried to wipe away his tears. He didn't even notice Hermione levitating the knife away from him. Now, for the next part, Hermione grinned wickedly, as her father stepped forward to help. Tom waved his wand, levitating Jean's body up and away from John. "You are monsters!" John shouted as he reached out, trying to grab Jean's body, to stop her from leaving him. But he was unsuccessful, unable to compete with Tom's magic. "This is everything you deserve," Tom sneered. "T. Lee," he called, smiling when an old female house elf popped in next to him. "Yes, Master Tom?" she asked as she gave a curtsy. "It's time," he grinned, laughing when the elf got a bloodthirsty grin on her face. "What can you possibly do to me after this?" John cried as Hermione and the small creature stepped forward towards his wife's body. "Well," Hermione laughed, "since you asked. Magic can do some amazing things. Like creating the perfect crime scene." Harry laughed as he moved to stand with his sister again. "We will dump your dear Jean in the garden of your holiday beach house in Bamborough. With an anonymous tip, the Northumbria police will find her body," Harry delightedly shared. His sister's plan was genius. "Your family's precious reputation will crumble," Hermione took over. This was everything she had hoped it would be. "Because with her body, will also be this knife." Hermione nodded her head at the weapon which was floating next to Jean. "Which is covered in your fingerprints, Johnny." Hermione laughed at John's devastated face. She knew he had realized what this would mean. Although his reputation wouldn't feel that important, right now, with his wife being dead by his hands. It was that his 2 children would spend the rest of their lives believing he had killed their mother that was destroying him right now. It was still satisfying to tear down the reputation they had cared so much about. "Everything will point to you killing your wife before fleeing. You know, I am feeling rather vindictive today. Perhaps I will also implant false memories into Ophelia and Claudius' minds of them only just surviving. Memories of you trying to kill them after they walked in on you cleaning up their mother's murder scene." John broke, screaming in agony at the idea of his children thinking he would ever hurt them. That his precious Ophelia and Claudius would believe he murdered their mother in cold blood. The world would think him a murderer. His mother might die of a broken heart. His friends and family would talk about how they never saw it coming. "You know what to do, T. Lee," Hermione smiled, watching as the elf nodded and disappeared with the body and knife. John sobbing uselessly. "Slate!" Cassie called out, John startling when another elf popped into the room with a loud crack. "Yes, mistress?" the elderly elf croaked. He was the life mate of T. Lee. The 2 of them once worked for Cygnus Black, but when Cassiopeia moved out on her own and eventually married with kids of her own, they had followed her with the promise to Cygnus they would watch over his daughter and grandkids. Their friends and co-elf workers Indigo and Sangria had gone to Bellatrix, Lapis and Juniper to Narcissa, and finally Heliotrope and Celadon to Andromeda. "Let's get the 3 muggles back down into their cells," she smiled as she moved to check over Hermione, making sure her daughter wasn't having any unwanted side effects from using the Imperius. But she seemed in perfect health with no complications. "You 2 did extraordinary today," Tom said proudly. "You cast spells that should have been well beyond your years, and yet you did it with ease, power, and control. But just as importantly, You faced your childhood demons. I cannot express how proud I am. He hugged them both tightly. Now I want you to both spend the rest of the day resting. Cassie added, give your cores time to recover before we do it again. Tomorrow? Harry asked eagerly, making his parents laugh. If there are no cramps to your core in the morning, then yes, Tom said as Cassie nodded. Now run along and maybe have a nap if you can. He kissed their heads. Now, I have an hour before my meeting with Lucius, Amelia, and Minister Fudge. If you need me, I shall be in my office going over some paperwork. The goblins had finished all paperwork and files on the history of Dion Leclerc's life and falsifying the family tree. He would be Lord Slytherin again, faster than he had expected. He couldn't wait. Dumbledore would know who he was. But he could never prove it. Tom would be ready. Chapter end notes. Thank you all for being patient with me. Thank you those who left encouraging comments. You guys kept me going through the struggle. I am back in work for the first time in 2 years and it has been difficult. I love the job and my coworkers, but mentally and physically it's draining. But I am forming a routine and getting back on track. This FIC is the start of my life returning to the new normal. Thank you everyone. I truly don't deserve the love I get, but wow, it makes everything easier on the bad days. XXXXX Love Mermaid. Chapter 6 Chapter notes. Hey guys. I am back with another chapter. It is shorter than the last few, but I am happy with it. TW. Torture, Unforgivables. We are finally starting to see more darkness to the twins and their family. I am having a lot of fun with it, even if it can be difficult to get my vision down without changes occurring. Haha. I hope everyone enjoys this chapter. Please let me know if you did or didn't, or any mistakes I may have missed. Harry groaned in frustration as Petunia screamed in agony when his attempt to use the Imperious Curse failed again. He had been trying for 2 days now, and every time he tried to wrap his core around the strings of connection, they would snap painfully. Every snap made Petunia feel like she had just undergone a lobotomy without pain medication or anesthesia. Fuck. He raged, green eyes darkening in his anger, giving in to the childish urge to stamp his stopped himself from throwing his wand. He completely ignored Petunia on the ground crying and turned to face his parents. It had been 4 days since he first tried the Cruciatus Curse, and he was already very adept at it and loved it. But the Imperious was slipping through his fingers every try. He didn't understand. Hermione wasn't having any trouble with it. It seemed to be the curse she picked up the quickest. Why can't I do it? He whined. But he would deny he did if any of his friends asked. Cassie suppressed a coo at her son's forlorn expression, knowing he would not appreciate it. I believe your distaste for letting your occlumency shields down is what could be stopping you from casting the curse correctly. Tom hummed in thought. You have been forming your walls since you were 5 and have had them solid and unmovable since just before you started at Hogwarts. Or maybe it's because he can't focus on anything for any longer than 30 seconds, Hermione teased with a laugh, skillfully dodging the Crucio her brother threw at her half-heartedly. Harry, don't curse your sister with unforgivables, Cassie scolded. Her tone and expression say she never thought she would have to say that sentence. Hermione, don't wind up your brother, Tom sighed with an eye roll, knowing these two could devolve quickly. You are an emotional caster, Cassie soothed her frustrated son. You have proven that with how quickly you picked up the Cruciatus and by casting it hot. Exactly, and you are already extremely skilled with the Cruciatus. Tom piped up, well beyond what your mother and I expected. Unfortunately, the Imperious is very different from the Cruciatus, so I am not surprised it isn't coming as easy to you. Everyone has an unforgivable that they find the easiest of the 3, and many even have one they can't ever cast successfully. The Imperious takes a lot of mental fortitude and patience. Can the victim feel the connection and bond with the core like the caster? Hermione asked, head tilted to the side. Those with a magical core can, Cassie nodded. She was oblivious to the devious smirk on her daughter's face as she looked at her husband. Muggles can't, and I don't believe creatures, magical or not, can feel it, but I am not positive. Hermione, Tom warned as she raised her wand, but it was too late. Imperio, she whispered, her green eyes narrowed in concentration. The white glow emitted from her wand before encasing Harry just as he realized what she was doing. Harry felt his entire body relax, and a quiet peace entered his mind. He didn't even remember what had him so stressed before this. He blinked. What had he been doing? No, that's not important right now, a soft command filtered through him. Those weren't his thoughts. He shook his head, attempting to clear the fog, blinking furiously to try and see. But the only thing he could see was clouds all around him. He wanted to panic, but the surrounding warmth wouldn't let him. He closed his eyes and focused on his breathing, just like when he meditated. He could do this. He opened his eyes again and grinned. "I know where I am," he proclaimed loudly. He thought he heard laughter at that. It was muffled, as if far away. But he didn't care. He knew where he was. He was inside his occlumency walls. He had loved flying since he was a child. It was the first part of his magic that he had fully accepted. Flying with his mother on her winged horse. Cassie had been given Epona when she had turned 17 and named her after the goddess of horses, and the patron goddess of mares and foals. Harry and Hermione had flown with their mother on Epona when they were little and couldn't sleep from nightmares. Then as Harry grew up, he found a love with flying on a broom. Taking to the skies was a blissful and powerful feeling. There had been no hesitation to make his occlumency mind palace the place where he felt so at home. It took time, but knowing where he was, that was a start. He started walking with purpose through the cool and damp clouds. He allowed himself to relax fully, using all his bravery to lower the clouds. It was the only way to find out what was happening. As he walked, the clouds slowly got thinner and the light from the sun started getting brighter. He started to run towards the sun, ignoring the strong echo that was back. "Listen to me," it said. Harry shuddered but forced himself to keep going without looking back. His body hair was sticking up in fear as it got louder. "Stop." With the last of his energy, he closed his eyes and bolted the final bit. Leaping forward into the sun, the surrounding warmth vanished entirely, and he gasped like he hadn't been breathing, desperately sucking in the air as his knees hit solid flooring. "Harry." His mother's panicked voice had him finally opening his eyes. He blinked quickly to focus his eyes. His mother was directly in front of him, her hands running over his face, and her gray eyes watery as she asked if he was okay. Behind her, Hermione was grinning widely at him, their father behind her with his hands on her shoulders. He was looking at Harry with pride and wonder like he had done something incredible. "I'm fine," he croaked with a smile at her. "Honestly, Mum, I am okay," he promised. He looked up at his twin sister sitting on his haunches. "You fucking cursed me," he said. "Language." His mother scolded immediately, although her fussing and worry took away any heat from the scolding. "Yes, I did," Hermione smirked, "and you fought me off in less than 3 seconds. Harry blinked, shocked. It had felt like an hour to him. "Maybe now that you know what that connection feels like and fought it off, you can follow it when you use it. You should have told us all what you were going to do." Cassie shrieked as she waved her wand over Harry. "Inurium revelare." She chanted, sighing in relief when the all-over body scan revealed no magical damage. Harry, however, was ignoring his mother screeching about how they would send her to an early grave and how she never thought she would have to tell her children to not curse each other, let alone as often as she did, and unforgivables at that. Harry was instead focused on Hermione's words. He had felt the warmth and connection, and he had even heard her. He was sure that the laugh he had heard in the clouds was Hermione. Perhaps he had said his thoughts of, "I know where I am," out loud, and that's what had made her laugh. He turned his eyes to Petunia and saw her lying on the floor where she had landed after the last attempt. He shook himself mentally, took a breath and opened his mouth. "Imperio," he chanted, throwing his concentration into the curse as the light flew across the room and hit Petunia. He allowed the clouds to thin out again, following the golden string he could see, wrapping his magic around it and allowing it to soak. Petunia immediately stood up, eyes wide as she stood stiffly. Unlike John under Hermione, Petunia looked very much like she was attached to puppet strings and was wooden. But the connection was there. "Turn around," Harry ordered shakily as he tested the curse. He couldn't believe it when she promptly turned. "I did it," he shouted, punching the air with his fist in excitement. Hermione just smirked and gave a playful huff when he stuck his hand out for a fist bump, but she gave him one with an eye roll. "Well done," Tom praised as he ruffled Harry's hair and Cassie kissed his forehead and cheeks. "I knew you could do it," she murmured, "and just because it worked doesn't mean you aren't in trouble for cursing your brother with no warning," she said louder without even looking over at her daughter. "Oh, come on," Hermione whined quietly. "What are you going to do now that you have control of the curse?" Tom asked Harry. "I'm not sure," Harry admitted with a hum. "Every time I talked about finally learning the you wanted to learn the Imperius and make people do embarrassing things. But now I am using it, and I am at a loss for ideas. The cruciatus just came so much more naturally. That's perfectly normal, Cassie soothed her son. Theory is veritably different from practical, and so many people find spells they thought would be one way end up the opposite. Can they feel pain under the imperious? He asked curiously, tilting his head much like Hermione had earlier. His green eyes stared at Petunia, who was just standing there, waiting for orders. Vernon was stuck against the wall with John, the two hovering above the ground. They couldn't do anything but watch, unable to say anything with the lip-lock jinx on them. But their eyes were expressive, John's brown eyes filled with fear and grief, and Vernon's blue screamed his levels of fear and anger. Yes, Cassie nodded, similar to the full body bind, the imperious does not block off the nervous system. When under both curses the victim can feel everything happening to them, but they cannot react to the pain, and in the case of the imperious, they would just keep going. Interesting, Hermione hummed thoughtfully, making a note in her journal which she remembered to bring after regretting leaving it behind on the first day. Only 4 days later, and she had already filled 6 pages so far, 3 for each the imperious and cruciatus. She was excited to move on to the last curse, the killing curse, Avada Kedavra. But with Jean already dead, she didn't want to end John's suffering right away, and the mental games she was playing with the man were extremely enjoyable. She had taken great pleasure in waking him up this morning with the news that Jean's body had been found by the police, and they were looking for John as a suspect while questioning his family. Lacarnum inflammari, Harry grinned, using one of Hermione's favorite spells. Small blue flames rip out of his wand and latch onto the bottom of Petunia's pants, burning away. He felt the imperious slip slightly at the distraction of casting a secondary spell, so he clamped his shield down on the bond and sent his magic to wrap around the connection again. Stay still, he ordered Petunia, smirking when she went ramrod straight, her eyes wide and teary and mouth open in a silent scream at the pain. He ended the spell before the flames could do too much damage, but he kept her standing on the burnt feet. He pouted when he noticed she had passed out from the pain and was only still standing due to the subconscious the imperious was controlling. My turn, Hermione smirked. Might as well let the weakling recover, Harry snorted, waving his wand absently and sending Petunia to lie down next to Vernon on the wall. Oh please, Harry grinned, bending over his waist, be my guest princess. He winked. Hermione rolled her eyes as he chuckled. Oh shut up, she muttered as he teased her with their father's nickname. But her brother just grinned wider at her before nodding his head at Petunia, who had Vernon looking down at her trying to yell for her, but he was still silenced. Shall we practice the Avada? He asked smirking. We won't get it right the first go anyway, correct? He said, directing the end question to his parents. Most likely not, Tom nodded in agreement. We could always practice on rats or rabbits. He was interrupted by 2 very annoyed and disgusted no's from the twins. He smiled before continuing, but I know what your answer is regarding that. So taking turns on Vernon is probably the best next thing. Cassie nodded beside him and waved her wand, releasing Vernon from the spell, keeping him up against the wall, and he floated over to be placed in front of the twins. His blue eyes were wide in fear. He didn't understand what they were talking about, but he knew it couldn't be good news. Avada Kedavra is the darkest curse in the wizarding world. Tom started his lecture, smiling as Hermione whipped her notebook and self-inking quill back out of her pocket. It not only kills the victim instantly with no trace or damage if used correctly, but it also has no counter charm or shield that will stop it. The only true known way to avoid it is hiding behind something solid. But even then, if the caster is powerful and precise, the object will either explode or disintegrate after the first hit. So make sure you have more than one boulder to hide behind, Harry muttered with a cheeky smile, laughing when his mother and sister rolled their eyes in unison. Just like the other 2 unforgivables, there is no wand movement needed, Cassie spoke up. Although Dumbledore likes to say that the cursed wound Harry Potter got on his forehead is the shape of the wand movement. What an idiotic theory, Tom huffed. Not only is his scar not even a real curse scar, but it is the shape of an arrow. Do you know how long it would take to make an arrow shape with your wand and still hit the target? He continued to rant. I mean, the logistics just aren't there. Every spell that has a wand movement has to take into account where the shape ends. All right. Apparently this is a trigger for you, Cassie said wide-eyed as she glanced at the twins who were barely holding on to their amusement. Moving on, dear, she said, patting his arm. Turning to the twins, she flicked her head in a tilt to her husband and her flicking her eyes at him incredulously. Her eyes and smirking lips said clearly, "Can you see what a drama queen your father is? This is what I deal with." Harry snorted loudly before composing himself quickly when Tom looked at him suspiciously. Only for Hermione to elbow Harry in her amusement, causing Harry to lose his cool and laugh loudly. Within seconds Hermione had joined him. The twins become useless. In their joy, hunching over and leaning into each other for support to stop themselves from ending up on the floor. Vernon watched it all, eyes darting around the room, constantly looking for a way out, even though he couldn't move with the magical binds created by the runes on him. He couldn't understand how they were so joyful, hurting them, monsters to the core. He could see his wife out of the corner of his vision. She was still lying against the wall, unconscious. He felt an anger bubble in his gut. It simmered there almost daily these days. They did not deserve this. Everything he did was to protect his family. Despair filled him. He had failed. He no longer believed his friends would find them. The daily use of magic to harm him had made him face up that magic could very well be hiding them from rescue. "Yes, yes," Tom sighed sarcastically. "Laugh at my pain." He rolled his eyes as they just simply laughed harder, but shared an amused glance with his wife. Now, he started when they had finally stopped laughing long enough to listen. The Avada is just like the Cruciatus. It is an emotional spell, one that will draw from your need and want. You have to desire the death of the recipient. Vernon jerked at that. Death? But it is a lot harder to master than the Cruciatus. Cassie warned them, do not get frustrated and angry if it takes time. It's very much like Cruciatus in many ways, but in some also like the Imperius. Harry groaned at that. He had only just cast it for the first time. That was barely mediocre progress in his mind. You need to let your emotions flood your core and soak the bond with your wand. It requires much concentration and focus, Tom elaborated. Don't they mean the same thing? Harry asked with large innocent eyes, but his parents could see the twitch of his lips and he tried to hide his cheeky smile. They can be used in place of each other but technically don't mean the same. Hermione immediately went into knowledge mode. Focus means prioritizing small and large goals. Like for example doing everything you can to complete your exams at the end of the year with good grades. Harry rolled his EWAS her example. Not something he could relate to, although he could replace that with winning a game of Quidditch or bringing down Dumbledore. However, concentration means directing your energy to particular tasks, ideally, in the hopes of it helping your goals. You ate a dictionary for breakfast, didn't you? Harry teased. I told you, Mother, Father, that we needed to be careful with how much she loves her books and consumes knowledge. Stop teasing your sister, Cassie scolded him, or her curse may land on its target this time. Harry started cackling as he noticed Hermione fiddling with her wand, eyes dark. To many, it would look like she was angry and upset at his mocking. But he knew he hadn't gone too far. He could still see the twinkle of faint amusement mixed with friendly exasperation in her left eye. The look he knew was mirrored in his right eye when the roles were reversed. Let's move on, and try this before you two end up dueling and practicing even more unforgivables on each other. Cassie sighed, making sure to step between them. They had the most peculiar relationship, one that she could not understand. She was not a magical mirror twin, nor did she suffer the way they did. Yes, her mother had been horrible, but her sisters and father had sheltered her enough and smothered her with love. She had known she was loved from her birth. The bond the twins formed from that alone would have made it, so she could never truly understand it, but after the blood adoption, she had seen them glow as a bond of magical mirror twins formed. It was true and pure magic. But so far beyond the magic that anyone knew. All she knew was she was grateful for it, and she also knew her husband was too. Now, Harry, because you were kind enough to offer up Dursley, even at the risk of knowing he could die earlier than planned, you can choose to go first or second. Cassie smiled, however, I do suggest going second, purely because not only were you using the Imperius quite a lot and using your core on a difficult spell, but also because you were then placed under the Imperius and then on top of that, used it correctly for the first time. It can take a moment for your core to balance after it all. My own can go first, Harry shrugged. He wouldn't admit it out loud, but he was still a bit shaky. Hermione narrowed her eyes at him intently. She noticed the small tremors in his hand almost immediately. But he was standing with no issue, his jaw was unclenched, and his green eyes alert and focused. So she didn't press him on it, yet. I apologize if I get this curse first go, she winked at her brother, before turning to Vernon who was looking extremely panicked right now. Now she sneered at the fat muggle, you are useless. A waste of space walrus who isn't even good enough to think about. But my brother deserves justice for all the abuse he suffered at your hands. She was spinning her wand around in her fingers furiously as she stalked a little closer. The only decent thing you ever did was leave him on the steps at the orphanage to be found by his real family. Although even that was not technically a good deed because you did it for your selfish reasons. Vernon started shouting something, but of course, they couldn't hear it due to the silencing charms. Which was probably a good thing, whatever he was saying wasn't worth hearing. I hope this hurts, she grinned sharply, her green eyes darkening in wickedness and anger, teeth bared as the corner of her lips pulled tight in her wide and threatening grin. Vernon's body wanted to flinch away from this monster, but the binds wouldn't let him. So he just watched in horror, trapped in his own body as she raised the stick she used to access her evil powers. Although now he thought of it, he had seen the adult woman. He would not call her a mother. Monsters were not mothers. She had done this evil without her stick a few times, and so had her partner. Why was he thinking of this? Shit. He shook himself mentally and his blue eyes focused back on the girl who was opening her mouth. Avada Kedavra. She shouted the strange incantation. He had noticed that when they used their evil it was never plain English, but he had no idea what it was. The tip of her stick glowed, bright green, the same shade as her and her brother's eyes. He had only had a split second before the green light engulfed him, but it seemed like time slowed down. He could see her eyes also starting to glow, her pupils shrinking in power. The light surrounded him, and he could feel his body being pressured, squeezed tight, and he was encased in almost unbearable warmth as pain shot through his body. He screamed, or at least it felt like he was screaming. He couldn't hear himself, but he wasn't sure if it was because he wasn't able to produce sound, or simply due to that magic thing the captors did to silence him and the others. Vernon was shaking when the pressure and warmth disappeared. His entire body felt like jelly and weak. He collapsed onto his knees, hard. His sight was just bright green dancing spots, unable to see much more than shadows. Nausea bubbled in his stomach and he was unable to stop himself from aggressively projectile vomiting. He could hear the disgusted yelling from the mini-monsters as they leapt to the side to avoid the liquid of stomach acid, water and soggy bread bits. Disgusting, Tom sneered, waving his hand quickly to vanish the mess and clear the smell in the air. Vernon stayed slumped on his knees as he gagged. It felt like his insides were threatening to come out with the bile. He wasn't a particularly spiritual person, but if he had a soul, he was sure he had just had it exorcised. I gotta say, that was not what I was expecting, Harry said after a brief shocked silence which was immediately broken by Tom and Cassie laughing. That is a pretty standard reaction to a failed or weak killing curse, Tom chuckled. Even though the spell wasn't strong enough to destroy the soul and mind, it was still strong enough to yank on them and budge them out of their locus. Locus? Really? Cassie asked incredulously. This is why people think you are pompous, she teased, kissing his cheek, and he shrugged with a grin. There is nothing wrong with speaking intelligently and correctly, he mock huffed before turning back to the twins. Harry? He asked. Are you ready to try? The boy grinned wickedly and nodded eagerly, stepping forward. How do you feel, Myone? Cassie asked, checking on her daughter. Okay. Hermione hummed as she tilted her head sideways in thought. A bit lightheaded, and it's weird, but it's like I can almost feel my core is half empty. That's good. All normal after using the 3 unforgivables, Cassie nodded calmly. No numbness in your wand hand? Or any black spots in your eyesight? Nope. Hermione shook her head with down pouty lips. And, the core thing is because your core is growing and adjusting to the new dark magic. Tom grinned. Only powerful magic users can feel it and identify what they are feeling. Hermione smiled smugly at his words. Of course, she had been able to, and she knew Harry would too. They were their parents' children after all. Harry stood in front of Vernon, tilting his head as he looked down on the muggle who would never hurt him again. My turn. He chirped musically, the dark smile and excitement in his eyes contrasted with his happy tone. Vernon coughed wetly, body trembling as the rune on his neck made him stand back up to face what was coming next. Avada Kedavra, he shouted, jabbing his wand forward, and just like Hermione's turn, the tip glowed with the green light before it burst forward in a bright green beam. His pupil shrunk as the green of his iris got bigger, and glowed as bright as the curse. Once again, Vernon's body was covered by the cursed light. His body suddenly pitched forward, his eyes clenched closed tightly in a scream or bite through his tongue. It was over, and he was back on his knees, retching hard. With a shudder and cough, he threw up again, but this time it was bright red blood filled his mouth and sprayed across the floor. "Well done." Tom praised, his red eyes shining in pride and joy. "That right there is the soul momentarily detaching. You are both bombarding every expectation I had for you two, learning the 3 unforgivable curses. How do you both feel?" Cassie asked, waving her wand over them, casting a basic health scan again. She let out a relieved breath and smiled when she read the results. They were fine, with no signs of ill side effects. "Good," the twins chorused with grins as they looked at Vernon sadistically. "Do you want to keep going?" Tom asked with a smirk. "Because if you need a break before continuing, that is normal," Cassie added. Harry and Hermione shared a grin and a silent conversation as their eyes met. Before looking back at Vernon, who was eyeing them wearily, his breathing was heavy as he gasped for air weakly. "We are only just getting started," they chorused, their green eyes glowing as they raised their wands. Chapter 7 Chapter Notes. Hey everyone. Sorry for the long wait, I hope you enjoy it. Let me know what you think, both compliments and criticisms are welcome. I have a Facebook, Remade, if you wish to see pictures relating to this FIC series and where I post updates when I remember to do so. Enjoy, Mermaid. See the end of the chapter for more notes. The 27th of August 1993. -9 days after Diagon Alley. -8 days since starting to learn the unforgivables. -4 days before the start of term at Hogwarts. The midday of August the 27th found 8 newly turned teenagers, all relaxing in the large recreational room of Riddle Manor. The 8 friends, Cambions as they had named themselves, were spread out across the large room in different states of rest. They hung out together while their parents attended the mandatory Death Eater meeting. Dion Leckler would finally emerge as Lord Thomas Dion Slytherin and be introduced to the wizarding world as the true Lord of Slytherin. His children Hartford and Hermione would finally have his last name and the heirship of Slytherin. But in the time leading up to the announcement, the inner circle would be extremely busy ensuring everything was in place. The 8 teenagers had been part of the beginning of the meeting, which was taking place in the grand ballroom on the first floor. It hadn't been as interesting as they had hoped when they had been invited, mostly just going over backstories and what to expect with them moving forward. In the end, all 8 of them had been relieved to be told they didn't need to stay for the rest of it and were welcome to leave. So together they had quickly made their way up to the second floor and beelined for the recreational room in the East Wing, just down the hallway from the bedrooms of Harry and Hermione, and the spare rooms. The large room had 4 long bone-white walls, a high vantablack ceiling and a matching black carpet that was so soft it felt like it defied even magic. The wall directly in front of the door was the longest side. The opposite wall with the door was technically the same length, but with the large double door, it lost some of the wall space. The first thing you would see when entering the room was the 8 large and beautiful prints on the longest wall. They were in the middle of the wall, hanging in black frames. Each frame depicted pictures of each of the 8 moon phases and was charmed to light up when tapped with a wand. To the right of the room were 3 large tables spread out with just enough room between them to move around easily. All 3 were Muggle table games, table tennis, pool, and table football. Then to the left was a child-friendly themed pub, with a house elf kitchen, all set and ready to pour any cold drink the kids could think of, and even make hot and cold meals. If they wanted anything they just had to call Pippin or Cinnamon, and they would appear eager to help their chargers and friends. The floor was littered with hefty beanbags for the children to sit in, all in garish bright neon colors that Harry had picked out with great amusement at his father's disgust. Currently, he was lounging in the green one, his entire body stretched out, with plenty of room on the large beanbag. He was lazily watching, with his head upside down, as Draco yelled orders at his table football players only to get frustrated when he remembered yet again it wasn't like wizard chess. Blaise cheered as he got a goal just as Draco had grabbed the rod of his goalie, groaning in defeat. He let out a snort of laughter as Draco started banging his head on the table corner in frustration. The blonde hated losing. Well, all of them did. But Draco usually took it harder. Especially to Blaise, Pansy and Harry, all 3 of whom were not exactly humble winners. Case in point. Blaise had proceeded to dance around the table singing, "Draco sucks. Blaise rules. Draco sucks. Blaise rules." Why is he singing in the third person? Daphne asked, baffled. Because he is a moron. Pansy offered teasingly from where she was perched on the table tennis board waiting for her nail polish to dry. Suddenly she felt the world shift and yelped loudly when Blaise, while still dancing past her, reached out his hands and shoved her off the table directly onto the pink bean-bag chair. Harry and Draco immediately burst into laughter as she sent a strong stinging hex only for Blaise to dodge it, and it hit Theo. The poor brunette had been minding his business reading so deeply, and unaware of the world, he screeched in fear and entered fight mode, throwing his book at Pansy's face in startled defense. All the teenagers fell into uncontrollable laughter together. It was chaos, but it was their chaos. It took a while for them all to regain their breath and stability, but even when they had, the smiles had not left their lips, and now and again another snort or chuckle would escape. They took a moment to relax and eat, calling for Pippin and Cinnamon to order their lunch and moving their beanbags to form a circle with decent space for the food. "Lunch is ready, young Master and Mistress Riddle." Cinnamon bowed as Pippin started magicking the food from the food trolley, in front of their charges and friends. "Fish with lemon and vinegar with chips slathered in gravy, tomato sauce and mayonnaise, Master Harry." Pippin grinned as the boy licked his lips. "Fish and chips with salt, pepper and vinegar." Cinnamon moved to help as well, taking the second dish to Pansy. "Bangers and mash with onion gravy and mint peas," Pippin said, smiling at Blaise, who sighed happily and immediately stuck his face close to the plate and inhaled deeply. "Pot roast with potatoes, Yorkshire puddings, carrots, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, peas and gravy." Pippin laid almost 3 identical plates in front of Daphne, Hermione and Draco. But Daphne didn't have carrots or Brussels sprouts and instead had extra mint peas. Hermione had everything, but her peas were plain instead of mint. Draco didn't have broccoli. It is one of the few things he refused to eat, and he had mint peas like Daphne with extra carrots. "Steak and kidney pie, no onions." Cinnamon smiled as Theo thanked her. Such a sweet boy, and a very good soulmate for Cinnamon's mistress Hermione. 2 loaded jacket potatoes with mushrooms, cheese, crispy fried onions, baked beans, jalapenos, and broccoli. Pippin handed off the last plate to a happy Luna who was wiggling side to side in joy. The 2 elves left a mixture of different fizzy pops for drinks in the middle. "Thank you, Pippin." "Thank you, Cinnamon." "Thank you." The 8 voices all blended, but the 2 elves could tell what they were saying and smiled at the warmth and happiness in front of them. "If youse be needings anything, youse be callin' us," Pippin said sternly before popping away with Cinnamon to Inoue children thanking them. "Merlin's beard. Those 2 go all out for just lunch." Blaise groaned obscenely as he took his first bite. "You do know we don't eat like this every day, right?" Harry laughed. "Not for lunch anyway. The Riddle and Black Elves just adore hosting, and so when you guys and guests are here, every elf we have goes big. Yesterday we just had leftover dinner for lunch." Hermione nodded. "Mally makes the best roast chicken sandwiches." Harry grinned, emphasizing the word best as he mentioned the head of the Riddle kitchen elves. The children didn't talk much as they ate eagerly, enjoying the flavors exploding in their mouths. The quietness didn't last long though, the teens scoffing the food down quickly and methodically. Before long they were all lounged out in their beanbags, happy with stuffed stomachs. "So only 4 days before we go back to Hogwarts," Daphne sighed. "Are any of you ready?" "Not really," Daphne groaned. "This summer went way too fast, and it took me way too long to do the summer homework this year. I just couldn't motivate myself with this heat this year." "Tell me about it," Blaise nodded. "I mean, don't get me wrong. I loved spending the 3 weeks on holiday in France with Dad's side of the family. But it just wasn't the same after the last few years spending all year at Hogwarts and then holidaying together." "You didn't mention the homework," Daphne teased Blaise as the dark-skinned boy just grinned roguishly. "I can do it on the Hogwarts Express," he shrugged, laughing at Theo and Hermione's identical looks of horror at the idea. "Absolutely not." Hermione shook her head, brown curls flying wildly. "Has anyone else left it to the last minute?" She groaned as Harry, Draco and Pansy all raised their hands. "I've done it all but the extra potions reading," Luna admitted. "To the library," Hermione ordered, with Theo leaping up so he could offer her his hand before she moved. She grinned when he hauled her up easily and kissed her hand, the grin turning into a smirk as the others groaned at her orders and muttered about mutiny and evil nerds. But still, they all got up and the others started calling for their private nanny elves to bring all their homework over from their homes. They walked down the halls of Riddle Manor as, what their uncles Rabaston and Barty affectionately called, the swarm. The next 3 hours passed relatively quickly for the group of friends as they worked together to finish their summer homework. Thankfully the Riddle Manor had a large library, and in the middle of the room was a round table big enough to fit them all. Currently, the table was covered in open books, long pieces of parchment, full inkwells and quills. Where did the book on charms go? Blaise groaned as he rubbed his eyes. He only had one more paragraph on the disarming charm left to go. Why Professor Flitwick had expected half a foot on each of the charms they had learnt the year before was beyond Blaise's understanding. He thought it was crazy to assign homework during the summer at all. Here, Draco said, handing the heavy tome over Luna's head towards Blaise without taking his gray eyes off his potions essay. Fuck, Blaise grunted as he almost dropped the book on Luna's head, unprepared for how heavy it was. Thank Merlin for Luna's gift, as the girl slouched just the right amount of space to avoid the book as Blaise steadied himself. Done. Harry shouted, startling Theo out of his concentrated reading as Harry slammed the book in front of him shut and signed his name on the parchment with a flourish. Summer homework should be illegal, Blaise bemoaned. He was writing as quickly as he could to get it all over and done with. Maybe Father can bring it up at the next Wizengamot meeting, Harry nodded hopefully as Hermione snorted. Yeah, because that will happen, she laughed with an eye roll. We can dream, Harry sighed as he leant forward, hands interlocking with each other on the table, as he rested his head on them. Luna. Hermione's panicked cry had the others snapping their heads to look at the petite blonde in worry. She had gone stock still, eyes wide open. Blaise and Draco threw their arms out, catching her as she fell backwards. If not for their Quidditch reflexes, she would have hit the floor hard. Together Blaise and Draco gently laid her down on the carpet, as everyone ran around the table to reach them. Is it a sight vision? Pansy asked as she took in Luna's flushed skin and glazed eyes, praying it was and not a combination vision. There are 3 main types of visions and prophecies. Type 1, the most common, and also the standard expectation of visions, is called a prophecy, or spoken vision. Luna's eyes would glaze over, her sight going black, and she would hear whispers faintly. The voice never really sounded like a person, but the words would flow into her. She would be compelled to repeat the words out loud, unable to control herself until it was over. Before learning occlumency, she would never remember these visions, always waking up out of the daze unaware of what had happened. Once she had mastered occlumency, she was able to create a location inside her safety walls to store these moments and could revisit each spoken prophecy whenever she wanted. The second type was visions, specifically sight visions, where the real world would fade away from sight and she would see things that could be happening as she saw it before her, be of what is to come in the future, or like 2 memorable moments, she could see things from the past that were suddenly relevant to what could happen soon. The third type was the worst, combination visions they were called, also known as sense deprivation. She would see it happening like sight visions, but she could also hear the voice and would speak what it was saying aloud, and she would also feel, smell and even sometimes taste a great deal of what was happening in the vision. These types had so far always resulted in seizures and left her weakened and sore for days. Thankfully they were also the rarest. She had only ever had 4 in her lifetime. The first was the most traumatic, being of her mother's death. She had been 9 and she hadn't remembered the vision at all, until a week later when it came true in front of her. She isn't seizing, Theo noted as he looked over her wide but unseeing eyes. She is coming out of it, Draco grinned in relief as Luna's blue eyes regained their color, blinking away the fog. Take it easy, Daphne said softly as Luna tried to sit up, catching herself on Blaise's lap when she couldn't hold her weight with her arms. Where is your family tree? Luna asked Harry and Hermione with a pant, each word accompanied by a sharp inhale as she struggled to catch her breath. Huh? Harry asked blankly. Luna, stop. Theo cried as she tried to yet again climb up to her feet, only to stumble backwards into Pansy, who immediately gripped the small blonde's arms and steadied her. I need to find it, Luna mumbled. It can't be true, I need to see it. Where is it? Harry shared a look with Hermione. They knew their friend, and if she was this determined, it was something serious. We can take you there, Hermione said, Luna nodding sagely, but only if you take a breath and wait for the vision effects to pass. Yes, yeah, okay, Luna nodded, stumbling after yet again trying to walk on her own. Thankfully Blaise had managed to shove one of the small reading armchairs directly behind Luna, and Theo wasted no time to push her gently backwards into it. "Oh, it's so soft," Luna whispered with a grin, running her hands over the material covering the arms of the chair. "Cinnamon," Hermione called, smiling when her nanny elf appeared. "Can you get Luna cold water with cucumber, lemon, ice and a teaspoon of sugar?" Hermione rattled off Luna's order. It was the same drink Lo have after a vision herself, and also when she was pregnant with Luna. Blaise, Harry and Pansy pulled a face behind Luna at the drink, as they usually did when she drank it. It was not a concoction they enjoyed. It didn't take long for Cinnamon to reappear with the drink. Handing it off to Luna, the small elf patted her knee fondly before popping away after making sure Hermione knew to call her if Miss Little Seer needed anything else. "How are you doing?" Draco asked as Luna sipped on the last of her drink 6 minutes later. "Better," she sighed with a smile. "I think I am okay now." "How many fingers am I holding up?" Blaise checked, but the jokester hid the 2 fingers up behind his other hand. "2," Luna replied with a smirk. "At least make it difficult by using a thumb," she taunted. For a moment it was light-hearted laughter between the group before they sobered up and caught their breath. "So, you said you needed to see the family tree?" Hermione prompted her. Luna nodded as she stood up to stand with her friends. "What was shown to you?" "I've never really had a sight vision I haven't believed before," Luna started, biting her lip as they walked out of the library. Everyone waiting for her to continue from what seemed like a random segue, but they knew from experience there was a reason for it. "But this one, it could change so much of what we know, and if the vision is wrong, and I say something before checking it, it could destroy lives." She paused before opening her mouth again. "Although, if it is true, it could still destroy lives, or save them," she whispered. Her friends all shared wide-eyed glances. What could she have seen? "Luna, has a vision ever been wrong before?" Blaise asked as Harry and Hermione led them down the grand staircase towards the first floor. "Sort of, but not really," Luna hummed. "A vision has never outright been wrong, but when some things are shown, I can usually feel if it is an absolute or if it will only happen if I don't change the course." "So what makes you think this one is wrong?" Theo asked, frowning. "If you can feel it." "This was different," Luna said, her lips twitching as she thought deeply about how to explain it. "It wasn't a vision of what could happen, or what will happen. It was more a vision of information that we need." "Well, that's helpful," Draco snorted sarcastically. "Why can't they just be straightforward?" "Because that would make our lives too easy," Blaise snarked. "Here we are," Hermione interrupted before Draco and Blaise could devolve into another one of their arguments. She reached her hand out to open the heavy dark wooden door. She grunted lightly when the doorknob stuck a bit and she applied more pressure. "Damn door," she muttered when it finally opened, only to stick halfway. "This room hasn't been very loved," Daphne commented as they entered the room, single file due to the door not opening any further. Harry waved his wand, activating the floating lanterns set up around the room, their glow illuminating the entire room. "Whoa," Blaise said as the lantern lights revealed the massive brown tree which was painted on and stretched out over the 4 walls, only breaking apart at the door. Each branch of the tree led to a small family, and then among the sticks, leaves and flowers were painted portraits of the family members. It was magically created. The portraits aged with the family members, and when new members were born or died the tree would shift to reflect it. "It's beautiful," Theo breathed, as he took in the intricate details. The walls were emerald green, the tree and its branches a sienna brown. The flowers were bright pink peonies, symbolizing honor, prosperity and wealth. The portraits of the many different family members had their names in gold cursive writing under each of them, along with their birth and, when applicable, their death dates. "I found you too," Pansy called with a grin, pointing out the 2 portraits side by side, Hermione Cassiopeia Riddle, and Hartford Thomas Riddle. Luna came over to trace their names, her eyes glazing slightly as she sucked in a breath. It was not enough to be a full vision, but enough that her friends all took a step closer to her. "These will change," she whispered, only just loud enough that they could hear her. "Once our Lord is recognized, so will you be. The true heirs of Slytherin." "Merlin's ballsack," Blaise gaped, dodging a disgusted Daphne's slap. "Are you saying when he takes his seat in the Wizengamot, magic will accept them as Slytherins? Just like that?" "Yes," Luna nodded. "It is not only their birthright but their destiny." "So, no pressure, right?" Harry joked. Hermione rolled her eyes at her brother, but he could see the weight on her shoulders just like his own. "Is this what you saw?" she asked, turning from Harry to Luna. "No," she shook her head, "this I saw many years ago when we first met. I knew we would be family, and by your side, loyal, is where I am supposed to be." "So what are we doing here?" Draco asked, not rudely but curiously. "How do you look like a Ponce in every portrait and photo I have ever seen?" Blaise asked before Luna could answer. The dark-skinned boy laughed as he pointed at Draco's name and face across from Harry and Hermione's. "I do not," Draco sniffed, offended, tilting his nose up and looking away from his friend. "Look," Pansy cackled, "it's the pose." "Oh, shut up," Draco huffed, turning his back to them. He would come up with a good comeback later. "For now, Luna," he prompted, ignoring Blaise and Pansy giggling behind him. They all watched as Luna's hand was resting on Cassiopeia. Dorothy Riddle née Black. Connected to her was Tom Marvolo Riddle, with Harry and Hermione below the couple, connected by gold threads wrapped branches. Luna traced Cassiopeia's name once more before moving. Her delicate pale hand went across the tree branches to the left, her manicured and pink-painted fingers smoothed over the sisters. Passing Narcissa Odette Malfoy née Black, who was connected to Lucius Abraxas Malfoy and Draconis Lucius Malfoy below them. Then her fingers danced over Andromeda Alberio Tonks née Black. Just like her sisters, she was connected to her husband, Edward Robert Tonks, and their daughter Nymphadora Swanhilda Tonks below them. The portrait currently had her signature pink hair. Then finally Luna stopped at Bellatrix Deneb Lestrange née Black, where she was connected to her soulmate and husband, Rodolphus Reinhard Lestrange. Everyone watched, completely transfixed, as Luna circled the name, tears coming to her eyes as she traced the branches down, to a single name below Bellatrix and Rodolphus. The silence the room was suddenly plunged into was heavy. Not even the sounds of breathing were heard as they all just stared in horror at the name in gold with an up-to-date portrait. Rigel Cygnus Lestrange, born the 14th of April 1980. Where's his death date? Harry finally choked out. The friends all shared a look of grief and fear. Are these things ever wrong? Draco asked Hermione and Theo desperately, gray eyes wide in shock. No, they chorused, Hermione, shaking her head in answer, and disbelief, before continuing. Family trees like this are attached to our family's magical core signatures. Rigel didn't die in 1980. Our cousin is alive.